Minutes meeting of the Audit Standards and General Purposes Committee. I just need to remind everyone first of all that the meeting is being webcast live and will be capable of repeated viewing. We now have some procedural business to go through. So declarations of substitutes. I know we have one. Councillor Robinson.
And declaration of interest, I'm a governor at St Andrews when we get to that part. And I'm substituting.
Not taking interest just yet. You're ahead of the game. You're a substitute.
Yes, for John Hewitt. Thank you.
For Councillor Hewitt. Thank you. Now we can take your declaration of interest.
I'm the governor at St Andrews Primary.
Okay. Has anyone else got any declarations? No. Okay. Great. And the final part of our procedural business is to consider whether we need to exclude the press and public. We never like to do that. We have new part 2 items on the agenda, so the press and public will not need to be excluded. Okay, thank you. Minutes of the previous meeting, page 7 of the agenda. As everyone, I'm sure, understands, this is not an opportunity to discuss matters arising, but just to check the accuracy of the minutes. Are there any questions of accuracy? No? Okay. In that case, does committee agree to approve the minutes of the previous meeting? Thank you. Right. Okay. My chair's communications, which will be fairly short. I'm pleased to say that we have Councillor Williams with us today, who will be able to help inform our discussion of the annual housing complaints report and self-assessment. Councillor Williams has another meeting to attend later on and has requested that we move this item up to be our first item, which I've happily agreed to. And obviously you're very, very busy, and we understand that, so that's appreciated. And I've also, Councillor Taylor is going to attend as well to help inform our discussion of the progress report on budget setting. Councillor Taylor has work commitments and will be joining us virtually. And to help Councillor Taylor manage his time as well, I've decided to move the budget report up to being the second item. So that's both those first. Just to say that earlier this month, I was invited to attend a meeting of the Regional Audit Committee Forum. I think that's the right title, which is basically an exchange meeting for audit and standard chairs in the South East. The main topic of discussion was on the changes to internal audit standards, there was a presentation presented by Diana Melville of SEPFA, and Diana authors guidance, so she's very authoritative on this matter, and it was very helpful to hear that presentation, and I think very timely for, certainly for myself, for the consideration today of the new global internal audit standards, which is on our agenda. The chief point that I took away from that presentation, just to share with members, because obviously you weren't able to benefit directly from that presentation, was that the global internal audit standards is the responsibility of Audit and Standards Committee, not just the chief auditor. So I hope we've all absorbed the report and that we take our responsibility seriously on this, and that we don't just find ourselves being led by the chief auditor on all of these matters. So, thank you. Right, now we will conduct the call over. Grace, if you can run us through.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Item 22, Internal Audit and Counter Fraud Quarter 1 Progress Report 25-26. Item 23, Global Internal Audit Standards Self-Assessment and Quality Assurance and Improvement Plan. Item 24, Annual Housing Complaints Report and Self-Assessment. Item 25, Progress Report on Budget Setting. Item 26, Whistleblowing Interim Update. Item 27, Standards Update. Okay.
Before you just say which one's been called, because Grace says which one's been called, I always struggle with this part of the process with my hearing. So what have we had that's called? Because I might call something else myself if that's possible.
All items have been called, Chair.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant. Okay, very straightforward. Thank you. Okay, public and member involvement. We have not received any items from residents or councillors to consider. So we can move on to our first substantial business, which is the annual housing complaints report and self-assessment. This is to be introduced by Justine Harris and is it Michaela? Michaela Beck. Okay. And Councillor Williams to help with that. Okay. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And if that's okay, I'd like to introduce the report. So I'm very pleased to be here today and to present the Brighton and Hove Council's annual housing complaints report and self-assessment. And this is prepared in accordance with the Housing Ombudsman's Complaint Handling Code, which became statutory in April 2024. Now, this report very much reflects our ongoing commitment to transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement in our housing services, which is exceptionally important to us. The code itself sets clear expectations for accessible, timely, and well-governed complaint handling. Your feedback today is really important for us to hear, and we will take note because this will help shape our final published statement on this. So we will be very pleased to hear it. Now, as Cabinet Member for Housing and member responsible for complaints, I'm very proud to note that this is our second annual self-assessment underway under the new requirements, and this report demonstrates real progress. I'm so pleased, and I want to thank everybody involved because I do know there has been a huge amount of work involved in getting us to this standard. We've got further to go, of course we have, but we have made some real progress. Complaints about repairs, maintenance and property improvements have fallen by 12%, now representing 68% of all housing related complaints, evidence of significant improvements in our repairs service. And as we've noted and I've reported before in this chamber, we are getting through something like 3,000 repairs every month. So we really are getting through them at a rapid pace. These improvements are echoed in our tenant satisfaction survey, which shows satisfaction with repairs has increased to 68%, and an overall satisfaction with housing services has risen to 67%, up from 65% last year. In 2024-5, we received 775 stage 1 complaints. 55% of those were upheld or partially upheld, and over 80% responded to within our 10-day target. Now, we are encouraged by these results, but we do recognise that we need to further improve the response time, especially for the more complex cases, which may need escalating. So we need to improve our response time for that, and that is recognised. We've introduced clearer leaseholder consultation. We've updated policies for our vulnerable tenants, and we've greatly improved our approach to fire safety and damp and mould issues. And please may I take this opportunity to introduce our war on damp and mould for this winter. We are standing up a specialist team. I do this at every opportunity, I know. I carry this everywhere I go, you know that. Because I'm very excited about this, because we are way ahead of AWAB's law coming in later this year, and we are taking action to help tenants deal with damp and mould. So you will all see this soon, and you'll all be invited to a member briefing very soon. sorry about that, blatant advertising, couldn't have it. But this is really important because this is part of this council being responsive to our tenants and what our tenants need and what our properties need. And damp and mould is a real problem in our city, and we're now making huge efforts to tackle it, and I'm sure people will be pleased to hear that. So we've also strengthened our resident engagement, including co-produced workshops to inform our Creating Great Homes Together plan. And we also had a very successful tenant celebration day a couple of weeks ago, which was really rather lovely. And we've got a beautiful film that we are going to distribute, aren't we, made by our tenants, about what our tenants get up to and some very positive actions within it as well. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Justine, who might want to give you some further details. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. So committee will have two appendices with this report. So the first one sets out the context service performance over 24-25. It also shows how complaints are helping to drive service improvement. It includes a section on complaint resolution performance and also where we've not met compliance. The second appendix is a pro forma self-assessment form, and this shows how we've evidenced to meet the code requirements. So all social housing landlords will have had the same form to fill out. So if you've looked through it, you'll see some of it is quite repetitive. So Michaela's just going to share a slide up on the screen. Thank you, Michaela. So the recommendation for Audit and Standards General Purpose Committee today is to review and provide comment on the annual housing complaints report and self-assessment. So as Councillor Williams set out, this makes us compliant with the Social Housing Regulation Act 2023, and this report will be published on the council website, and we need to do that to ensure we're compliant. We need to do that by the 30th of September. So the council's landlord duties, for those that aren't so familiar with this area of the service, cover over 12,000 residential rented properties and over 2,000 leasehold properties. This report also meets council plan outcomes, so homes for everyone, access to decent, affordable housing is fundamental and key to people. We recognise it's key to people's well-being, and a responsive council with well-run services. So we will listen to what residents and other customers tell us and respond to their feedback as demonstrated in the report. So this slide sets out how the report and our approach to complaint handling reflects our ambition to be a learning organisation. So as Councillor Williams touched on, this involved active collaboration and engagement with residents. So this year with co-produced workshops with tenants and staff, it focused on key themes that came from the analysis of complaints. So this is set out on page 2 of the report, or page 60 in the pack, and covers the day-to-day repairs, complaints handling, health and safety, and customer service and communication. So this report also sets out examples of improvements we've made, such as digital access, improved response to resolving noise nuisance, and improvement of cleaning and maintenance standards. To add as well, Council's effort to embed a more resident-focused response to reports of antisocial behaviour and develop and embed a new policy of reporters of hate incidents reflect the Council's commitment to diversity and inclusion with a focus on early intervention and support. The report also emphasises the importance of a healthy and psychologically safe environment for both residents and staff, with initiatives to improve communication and provide better training. We really welcome the oversight provided by the Housing Ombudsman Complaint Handling Code and recognise that a positive complaint handling culture allows us to identify key challenges and enhance our service delivery. Thank you, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. It is much appreciated, because at the chair's briefing, I thought that it would be helpful to actually have a PowerPoint as well as a verbal presentation, because this is the first time committee has had the responsibility of looking at this annual report, and I thought that members would need as much help as possible to understand the matters at hand. So thank you for that. Have we got any questions? Councillor Meadows.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Justine, for a very clear report. Just a couple of questions, though. Neighbourhood team presence on page 60, bottom of page 60, talks about dedicated staff recruited to regularly visit estates to identify and resolve issues early. Is this the same sort of neighbourhood walkabouts that used to happen pre-COVID type things, so that a tenant rep could go with you, particularly around blocks of some of our tower blocks and etc.? I just wondered, because ward councillors used to get invited to those, but I've never been invited since COVID. So that's my first question. And the second one is on the diagram on page 61. I noticed like the type of complaints that have been used: staff conduct, failure to take action, unhappy with service delivery, and then over the page you've got estate management services and delay in providing outcomes. They're all sort of staff focused issues, in my opinion, because they're about whether it's staff working on the ground or in the office. They're all, you've got people behind those decisions. I just wondered, you know, is training ongoing? Are they new staff? Is it being reinstated training? I just wondered, you know, how that was being dealt with, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. A couple of questions there.
If I can just say a little bit about the neighbourhood team, which I'm really proud to say we've now got off the ground, and there will be 2 per area, north, south, east and west, and they will be patrolling all areas regularly, and ward members, councillors are very welcome to attend. If we can make it, we can certainly arrange that. And I think it is a little bit like the sort of estate visits, but this is going to be an ongoing thing, so that's their role, and they'll be out and about all of the time, meeting residents as well, looking out for things themselves as well, as, you know, rather than waiting for people to be reporting into us. So yeah, by all means, we can arrange that, can't we? If you want to have a little visit around with them.
So that was the one about visits, the staff complaints and training.
So in response to the staff and training, we are looking at doing ongoing refresher training for existing staff, just to reinforce messages about customer service and what we expect for our tenants. We're also looking to do customer service training as part of our induction process. It wasn't previously part of it, but we've got a new customer service supervisor who's adding to our training for our staff, and it will form part of our induction for new staff.
I hope that improves that then. Thank you.
Councillor Lockram.
Apologies for the noise interference. I'm not quite sure where that's coming from. Thank you very much for the report and for all the comments that officers have made. I am pleased to see that there's been some improvement and that various actions have been put in place, which seem to be, you know, fundamental, but also quite radical, that the council haven't done before. So this is really changing the paradigm model compared to previous years, it seems to me. The top 3 areas of complaint in 2024 and 2025 in relation to the condition of property repairs, maintenance and improvement, because they constitute 68% of those. And then the lesser areas of staff conduct and a response to service delivery. And the report refers to incidences of maladministration and service failures for which there have been apologies. So what I wanted to ask about specifically was to what extent the service can anticipate and identify the most likely nature of the complaints in the pipeline. I mean, is there a kind of anticipatory model that you're looking at to try and mitigate the complaints actually escalating into a formal complaint rather than a tenant bringing something to the attention of staff immediately and then getting in there quickly? So is there a model for that? And I also want to say that I'm pleased to see that, you know, maybe that model, if there isn't already a model, could come out of these co-produced workshops, which I think is an important vehicle for feedback. And I hope that that will continue. And I just want you to elaborate on what is happening with that for future and how that might inform key priorities going forward. And the other question I've got is, have there been any recommendations from the Housing Ombudsman for financial awards in any of the maladministration findings? And I note there was a severe maladministration case in the summary of the cases. And I wonder if, even if there wasn't a recommendation for financial compensation, whether there is consideration of that when a tenant has been put to severe disadvantage or discomfort as a result of the condition of property. Thank you.
Quite a few there.
That many of these Housing Ombudsman's complaints that have now been completed are historical and come from like 2021, 2020. They've been going on right even before our time. So they've sort of the journey is now complete here with us. And there are instances where people do get financial contributions to, you know, when they've had complaints, and even sometimes we do that without the Ombudsman if we feel that somebody's waited too long and we can compensate them. So that does actually happen. And I know you'd like to add a bit more.
So just on the point about the maladministration, we do give final recompense either before there's finding by the Ombudsman, but it is usually a recommendation following that finding. So that is something that happens. And there are a few other questions. Shall I go on to those? So one of the first things you asked, I think, was about early intervention and prevention, stop things from escalating. And Michaela might want to say more about repairs, the volume of complaints and repairs, but that is a reflection as well about the number of contacts we have. So the service is undertaking over 3,000 repairs a month, so there's a high volume there. And in regards to early intervention, so that really links in very much to the co-produced workshops. So how do we stop that from escalating? So a bit more about that. So the day-to-day repairs is really it addressed areas such as improving the quality of repair, preventing missed appointments, and enhancing the diagnostics. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so we do look at our complaints as they come in. We monitor them throughout the teams and across the service as well. So we have oversight of the total complaints and the type of complaints that we receive. When we see a reoccurring issue, we take actions to fix that in the individual team where the issue was raised, but also across the service. Just to reflect again on the number of complaints received by repairs, we do think that's to do with the number of contacts we have being so high, with over 3,000 repairs completed each month.
You happy with that? Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Councillor Baghoff and then Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jill, for the report and for it's clear, like my colleague said, that you have made some drastic changes which are very positive. And my question is around the complaints concerning the is it the staff conduct? I've just lost the page, sorry, just give me a minute. I understand the staff conduct, it has increased. So that's something negative from, I think, was it 2.27 in between 23-24 to 8.41. My question is, how do you collect this data about this? Is it through complaints from the residents? And if it's so, how do you validate and how do you deal with it later on? And why is this increase? Do you have any specific, have you focused on a specific cause which could have raised this, type of issue? Do you have, for example, have you had replacement of staff, or is it working condition? And in general, how do you deal with it? Thank you.
So what we're trying to do is, instead of having an issue with staff conduct that we address with that individual, we're trying to learn from those issues and do training for all staff. So we've expanded our training, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure it's part of our induction, but also part of ongoing training for staff to help reduce the complaints related to staff conduct.
There was also the point about data collection.
So when a complaint is received, it will be categorised into the type of complaint. So we would receive a written complaint or a verbal complaint from a tenant, and that would be given a category of complaint, and staff conduct is one of those categories.
Are you content, or have you got a follow-up, Councillor?
Yeah, I think two of them are answered. But how do you validate? Because, I mean, do you take the word of the resident, or do you have a process whereby you validate whether the thing, whether the staff will have his say and clarify? Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. So is there a process whereby the staff has a chance to?
Yeah, so we would speak to the individual concerned and find out the facts behind it. Yeah, in each case, we would speak to the individual that the complaint is related to.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. So you mentioned the large number of repairs that are processed per month, the 3,000. We see in the paper there were 572 complaints. So you're just using my calculator. If my brain's working correctly at this time on a Tuesday afternoon, which it should be, that calculates to something like 0.15% of those repairs lead to a complaint. What I think, which is pretty nothing actually, of course, any resident putting forward any complaint is not a good complaint, but it's quite low. But I just wondered if you had any benchmark data against other authorities. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here, but I think it would be useful for us to know how we compare to our neighbours. Thank you.
So we do have benchmarking data, and I can share that with you. Not in the meeting now, but I can share benchmarking data. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions from yourselves. I've got a couple of points to raise. I mean, the report sets out, very, very good to read that the complaints about maintenance and repairs, which are, it's a considerable number, but then that's because there are a lot of repairs, that they have reduced. So well done on that. But it's not all good news. And as other members have said, there is complaints about staff. And while they aren't as larger numbers as the repair ones, which is understandable, they are still very significant. And I don't know whether we've completely got to the bottom of how you are addressing those complaints arising about staff. I also always wonder about complaint fatigue, because if some residents will perhaps this won't be the first time they've tried to complain. So, is there any sort of measure given to how that might be impacting figures as well, so that we don't want to rest on our laurels about what looks like a reduction for good reasons, because it could be a reduction for bad reasons as well. So the Ombudsman comment on page 64 about investigating the 10 complaints, which I think you've said, Councillor Williams, are historic, but it does talk about learning lessons from that. So I'm just wondering what those specific lessons are.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, they are historic, but we do take very seriously those comments, because we will learn from them, because we don't want to repeat anything that has been happening in the past. We want to improve greatly, absolutely right. And there is such a thing. I do agree with you. Some people get like, I feel like I'm complaining and it's falling on deaf ears. So our complaint process altogether, we are trying to make it easier, aren't we, for people to come to us. And also some people are nice, they don't want to complain, but they do have a point to make. So it's reporting. If you don't want to complain, but please report to us. Please tell us what is going on. And we are very much with our community engagement teams. We've done lots of door-to-door welfare checks and tenant checks as well, speaking to people one-to-one. And we get a lot of information that way from people, things that need reporting, don't we? Our estates team are out and about every day as well. And we're also engaging a lot more with residents in various different formats. And I know that you're going to elaborate a bit on that.
Our colleagues have also been trained that if a tenant expresses any dissatisfaction, that we would take that as a complaint. So any form of dissatisfaction expressed, so they wouldn't have to call us and say, I want to make a formal complaint to you. If they say, I'm unhappy with something that's happened relating to the repair service, we would log that as a formal complaint.
Okay, thank you. The final point I wanted to raise, and I see Councillor Baghoff, I'll come back to you, is coming back to the point that Councillor Meadows made about ward member invites. And actually, this is something we've been experiencing generally in opposition, that we're no longer getting invited to things across the board. And I know that senior officers have been trying to address this with staff at all levels to make sure that we are being invited. It's now interesting that Councillor Meadows raises this point about housing visits, because obviously we've got a very close relationship with our housing tenants, and it's really important that ward members are invited. So I know you said you will look into that, make sure that it happens, but if, I want to stress that that's incredibly important and needs to be happening. Thank you.
Very quickly, and then you can take over. Yes, I completely agree with you. And we are now arranging a series, actually, of all-member workshops on, I'm going to do it again, on damp and mould and other issues, because I absolutely agree. I think all members, all councillors represent their constituents, and they need to have that information to be able to do so. So we are in the process of arranging those. Thank you.
Thank you. So just on the estate inspections, we're launching the estate inspections at the end of October, and the dates will be published on our web pages, and all ward councillors will be invited to those. So what neighbourhood officers have been recruited over the last few months, and what they've been doing is checking the routes. So they've walked 128 different routes, and we'll be doing those on a cyclical basis. So it'll be 2 a week.
Well, we'll just have to see that that's working well, won't we? Thank you. Councillor Baghoff.
It's not a question. It's just a comment. I am about the staff, conduct. I'm just wondering whether, because of the way the service has improved, how you have improved in the complaint process, because even that's a feeling with my caseloads with the with the residents. I think that improvement, the way you take cases more seriously now, making the process more, rapid in dealing with the problems, could it be the one of the causes whereby residents are feeling more comfortable to report? That's why the percentage has gone up. This just something I think could be a cause. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that point. If there's no other comments or questions, we'll move towards the recommendations. Let's get those in front of me. Okay. Yes, so we're often asked us to note reports, but the recommendation on page 55 is that we, having reviewed the report, provide comment on the annual housing complaints report and self-assessment. And I think we've done that. Hopefully, I feel we have. So, okay, are members happy to agree the recommendations? Thank you. So, moving on to our next report, and I'm glad to see Councillor Taylor has joined us online. This is the progress report on budget setting on page 103 of the agenda, and John Hooton will introduce, and I'm sure Councillor Taylor will be able to answer a lot of questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. So just to briefly introduce the report. So there is a short cover report within the papers, and then an appendix to that report, which is the budget report that went to Cabinet in July. Just to sort of place this in the context of the Audit Committee very briefly, part of the work that the external auditors do broadly two pieces of work. The first piece of work they do is they review our accounts and they sign off on our accounts, and that work is ongoing. We'll come back to the next committee. But the other thing they do is they look at value for money. And their value for money judgment is informed by the council's budget planning, the council's financial management, the council's approach to financial sustainability, and all of those things. That work again is ongoing, and we'll come back to the next Audit and Standards Committee. But this report, I suppose, just provides a high-level update on the council's budget process, and actually quite a lot of the things that are in the report are the things that the auditors will comment on and feed back on when they report back later in the year. So the report broadly talks about the overall financial climate. It's fair to say that councils across the country have pretty difficult financial conditions at the moment. Lots of service pressures, many of which we see in Brighton and Hove. So pressures around temporary accommodation. So both the numbers of people homeless presenting to us who we have a duty to care and provide housing for, but also the costs associated with temporary accommodation. As rents go up, clearly costs associated with temporary accommodation go up as well. We also have pressures around children's social care and adult social care placements. Again, a combination of sort of numbers and complexity, but also the costs associated with those placements. And I think it's fair in simplistic terms that the funding hasn't kept pace with some of the pressures that we see over recent years. When we look at our budget for the next few financial years, and particularly focusing on 26-27, our next financial year, the difference between our projected expenditure based on the pressures that I've described, and also things like inflationary pressures, and the expected income that we will get in as a council, that gap is 40 million for next year. So that's pretty challenging. And over the 4-year period, when we look forward for the next 4 years, that gap is 95 million by the end of that 4-year period. So it's quite a challenging budget position. There are a number of things, of course, we can do about that. Our overall approach, which is noted in the report, is around particularly focusing on how can we address the key pressure areas. So in things like temporary accommodation, can we invest in more preventative work so that we stop people becoming homeless, and we can prevent that, and that reduces the demand on our services. But also, can we find lower cost accommodation. So rather than going spot purchasing or going through private sector, other things that we can do as a council to increase our supply of temporary accommodation, which reduces the costs there. And there are similar things that we're looking at around children's social care and adult social care, in terms of both prevention, but also reducing costs of those placements over time. We're also looking internally at how we work as a council. So how can we invest in IT and digital to reduce the costs of our services and improve efficiency? And we're also looking at things like better utilisation of our property and our assets. So actually, can we increase our utilisation, which reduces our maintenance costs of our assets? And we're also looking at capital receipts as well, because that enables us to fund our capital programme without having to put additional revenue into paying off the costs of borrowing. So there are some of the approaches that we're taking. In terms of timetable, the draft budget will go through to Cabinet, we expect, in December. And obviously will be finalised in the usual way early in the new year in February next year. So I suppose this is just an opportunity, I suppose, for the committee to see where we are with the budget process. I suppose just quickly before I finish, just a word in terms of financial sustainability, because there is a graph within the report, the appendix to the report, financial sustainability. It's paragraph 3.5 that shows our comparative reserves position in Brighton and Hove compared to other unitary authorities. And as you can see on that graph, we are right on the left-hand side. So we are one of the lowest when you look at the amount of reserves that we have compared to our expenditure. So that is one of the key issues that the external auditors identified in their report last year, which was actually our financial sustainability and our level of reserves is incredibly low, and we need to work to improve that. That level of reserves has gone up slightly. In 24-25, at the beginning of the year, it was under 7 million. It's now up to 9 million, so we've increased that slightly. And this report also talks about some of the things that we'll do to just bolster that position and provide a little bit more of a buffer, if you like, in terms of our reserves position. So those, I think, are the key points I wanted to bring out, Chair. But I don't know if Councillor Taylor wants to come in, or obviously happy to take questions.
Yes, Councillor Taylor, do you want to come in now and say a bit more, and then we'll get to questions?
Just very briefly, Chair, John covered it well. I'll just point out of the body of the main report, section 10 obviously has an indicative budget development timetable, and given we're sort of talking about budget setting process, that one's quite key. It is somewhat dependent on external factors, mainly the timing of government publication of both their final position on the fair funding review and then indeed our actual settlement that we will get as a local authority, which will obviously then determine what our final budget position is, and the level of savings that we will have to make. But what I have said already to the overview and scrutiny committees is that we, based on previous feedback, we want to try and publish a draft budget as early as possible. In the previous 2 years, it's ended up being published fairly late because we've got the settlement fairly late. We're hoping we get it a bit earlier this year, and indeed we know that we're going to get a 3-year settlement. So hopefully that facilitates publication of a draft budget the right side of Christmas, so this side of Christmas, to allow it to go to scrutiny committees, in advance of it getting into the cycle of budget setting and obviously February budget council. But I think that's it on sort of process, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Councillor. I appreciate that quite a bit of it is based on assumptions at this stage, but nevertheless, it's pretty alarming reading. The scale of the task ahead. I'm going to ask members if they've got questions. Councillor Gilmore. Oh, I know what I was going to say, just because we've been talking about processes here. The value for money report will come into the special meeting in November, so that's all part of our considerations of that are leading into the budget process, which I really appreciate our involvement, really, an opportunity to be able to look at this properly in a timely way, because there was going to be the possibility it was all going to be a bit too late before we got to say anything. But bringing this report today to us is is really appreciated, and the November meeting will be very timely too. So, Councillor Gilmore.
Yeah, I suppose my first question would be for John and Jacob, and it's good to see that you're rebuilding reserves, and that's a real kind of central plank to the kind of financial stability that you kind of really want to push through. And I just want to kind of say that it's obviously it's good to be building on what happened under the previous administration, where the reserves were run down, and I'm looking at 3.5, 3.6 authorities' low level of reserves, mean that any of these risks individually or collectively could wipe out reserves. 3.7 financial management across the organisation is generally strong. So we've got a good, strong management structure, but those decisions were made at that point in time, which is a shame. And I suppose my question is, can you kind of give a bit more information on the budget strategy in terms of restoring those reserves to a safe level and taking us out of the relegation zone, so to speak?
So I'm happy to go first on that, and then John may want to talk about the comparative piece and indeed his recommendations as CFO. But broadly speaking, as you say, Councillor Gilmont, the council, under different political leaderships over 20 years, actually has a strong record of financial management within year. We obviously had the overspend that you referenced, but actually comparing to other local authorities, they quite often overspend and simply dip into reserves. So we're an authority with good financial management overall in year, but that has to be set against we're high income and high expenditure council in terms of head of population, and we have low reserves. As you said, which means it puts us in a relatively precarious position where, officers and directorates were doing a good job every year of managing their in-year pressures and trying to get as close to being in-year on budget as possible. But there are various external factors that mean that at any one point something unforeseen might happen and it might be difficult or impossible to get to a balanced in-year position. And so that's why the sort of reserves are important. I realise it's sometimes a difficult message, and some people will say, well, why do you care about protecting reserves? You've got to protect services. And of course, we're trying to protect services at all times and improve services, by the way. But that reserve position is, I think, important because, we've got our working balance, but we also, other authorities have other ring-fence reserves that we don't, or earmarked reserves in a way that we don't. So we just don't have a lot of wiggle room. So I think it's really important that what we do at this point, now that we're going to get a more medium-term settlement from government, as I say, a 3-year settlement, that we think about in this budget setting process a proper plan for sustainability, which is to build up the reserve steadily, and I'll let John talk about what level we should be aiming for, and then thinking about setting budgets over a longer term period to get there. Now in February we will only set next year's budget, strictly speaking, on a line item basis, but what we should be trying to do is say, well, let's think about the next 2, 3, 4 years of being sustainable within the budget envelope that we're likely to have, which clearly can change a little bit based on income, our own levers of income that we have in terms of fees, charges, etc., but will be broadly known at that point. And then just sort of overall budget strategy, as I've said to other over in the scrutiny committee, the starting point really every year, or at least how I think about it, is how can you do things differently to protect the same level of frontline service? So starting point should always be, how can we ensure that the public get the same or better level of service and type of service and facilities, whether it's toilets, nurseries, libraries, etc., quality of service in terms of customer service, and then care type services, but for a sort of more efficient and lower cost base. So that's the starting point for every budget discussion in my mind, is how do you become more efficient? How do you break down silos? How do you deliver the same for less? And then the point that can't get you to a balanced budget position, you obviously have to think about other things in terms of income generation or changing the nature of services that are provided. And obviously that's what officers are currently doing in the background is drawing up a set of proposals to look at that large budget gap that Councillor West references. John, I don't know if you want to say anything on reserves.
Yeah, just briefly, you mentioned in terms of our sort of target level of reserves, and just in terms of increasing levels of reserves. I mean, ultimately, it's a fairly straightforward equation. Either we need to, save money in terms of delivering services or increase income to a greater extent. And obviously, if you can do that, you start to build up your reserves. It is worth saying we have built into our existing budget every year 1.125 million pounds that is topping up our reserves on an annual basis. So, the first thing to do would be to sort of protect that contribution so that gradually increases over the next couple of years. And obviously, if there are any other things that we can do in terms of maybe unexpected sort of windfalls that we get in as a council, that gives us opportunities to top our reserves up a little bit further. Just briefly, in terms of the target level of reserves, we've had a target for a little while of a working balance of 9 million. That 9 million hasn't moved for quite some time, and of course over time you have inflation, and actually our overall revenue budget has grown over time because that's the way things work in terms of inflation. And actually I think that 9 million is quite low, so that the report reference is actually an aspiration to get to sort of 12 and ultimately around about 15 million. I think would be a more comfortable place to be in. We won't get there overnight, but as I say, with those sort of annual gradual contributions, we should be able to get that there over the medium-term financial strategy.
Thank you. Councillor Gilman, you've got to follow up because that was a lengthy answer.
It wasn't. It's a lengthy answer. And I'm pleased we're going to that kind of midpoint of where Brighton Hove Albion normally sit within the table. So that's a positive. I had a question to do with the fair funding. So the report notes kind of reduction in resources is anticipated around that in terms of the government's new kind of fair funding, rebalancing around business rates and other things. So I was just wondering how we're kind of making the case, because it seems like from metric we're going to be given a bit of a kicking, and how we working with the Labour government to kind of really put our case forward for Brighton Hove around that kind of settlement.
So on fair funding, I guess there's a couple of things to say. First of all, as you can see in the appendix, if you look at Appendix 1, it's showing our forecast over 4 years, and that includes our estimated impact of fair funding review. So actually our resources will be going up. It's something like 15 or 16 million, I think it is, for next year. On our general fund, our resources will go up. That's obviously both a cash increase and it's actually a real terms increase if you compare to inflation. The problem is they're not going up as much as perhaps we would have expected pre the fair funding review. So we won't be getting money taken away from us. Our overall general fund will indeed go up, but perhaps not as much as we would have expected, or clearly that we would need to meet our service demand. Overall, what Fair Funding Review is trying to do is make sure that the funding for local government is targeted at deprivation and also taking into account the resource bases of different areas and different councils. So, in other words, they're trying to look at, are there councils that have very, very high tax base because they've got extremely strong housing market and extremely strong business environment in their area. I mean, there are some London boroughs, because of the nature of their local businesses, Canary Wharf in Tower Hamlets being an example, have just vast business rates that come in. And so they're trying to make an assessment of that tax base and then deprivation and then adjust the funding accordingly. I think that is a reasonable, if not laudable, objective to try and focus on deprivation. However, there are various things in there that we don't think are correctly calibrated. To give one example, when we're looking at the funding that comes through for homelessness and supporting temporary accommodation, etc., I believe that what they're saying in the Fair Funding Review is that they will look at the number of universal credit claimants in an area and use that to drive the level of grant that will be given. We think that's wrong. We think that disadvantages Brighton because we don't have a a nationally high level of UC claimants versus the national picture, but we do have a high level of families presenting as homelessness because our housing market is in such a bad position in terms of affordability. So that's the kind of feedback that we're giving to government, is say we're not objecting to the overall premise of what you're trying to do, but we do think you've got some things wrong in the way that you calibrated it, and we're making that very clear. And you know, often opposition councillors say, well, you never tell your government stuff. Well, we do actually, and on this one we think they've got elements of it wrong, and so that's the case that we're making. And I know a lot of other councils in similar positions are making similar submissions.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay. You good?
Yeah.
Councillor Meadows.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, John, for the report. I'm just looking at page 112 on the updated relative needs formulas, and it talks about how our Brighton Hove City Council would see its relative needs formula reduced on average by approximately 11%. I wonder what sort of amount that would be. Going through this report on the consolidation of the grants, that makes perfect sense. If we can roll it up into one grant as opposed to several different strands, that makes complete sense. But then I'm looking down at the council tax equalisation. It talks about this will redistribute resources from those authorities that have a reduced ability to raise council tax. So that's a question I have on that bit. The transitional arrangements, the idea of a 3-year period, that helps with planning our budget to make sure that we're getting the appropriate money and spending it appropriately. And then I go down to 4.8, and it talks about it is currently estimated that the council could lose revenue resources of between £7 to £24 million over the medium term. I take it you mean that's the 3-year period. I'm not quite clear on that one. In addition, a pressure has been included which reflects a £14.5 million loss of total revenue resources over that 3 years. And I just put those two together. That's around 38.5 million. So perhaps that's where your 42 million deficit came from that you used to talk about. This is the first time I've actually read this paper. So I just wonder, because when you talk about the homelessness and rough sleeping on the following page 114, it talks about a reduction of approximately 45% of the grant for homelessness and rough sleeping. So I take it that that's in addition to the 38, and that's where that piles up. I'm just concerned because this is a year or so ago, 2 years ago, used to sit in the chamber. Of course, you weren't there at the time, but we used to sit in the chamber and we would be told, your Conservative government's rubbish. Labour will give us all the money we want. And here we are with a £42 million plus deficit from a Labour government. So I'm just wondering, you know, how we can say that we are doing so well and it's everyone else's fault, but not the Labour governments, when it's the Labour governments that's giving us less funding. Thank you.
So I'll come in, Chair, and John may want to come in. In terms of balancing all those the different numbers in the report and trying to understand where we are potentially losing out on what's driving the deficit, I guess there's a few things to say. First of all, those different accumulation of figures across different areas where we may or may not lose funding is not really how you think about the deficit for next year. The budget gap for next year is £40 million, and that £40 million is set out in both the report and the appendix. And you know, in simple terms, our overall resources are going up. If you take, next year as an example, so if you look at page 2 of the appendix, next year as an example, the current net general fund for this year is 264.8 million. Next year it goes up to 281.7 million, so an increase of 15 million or 16 million. The problem is that our service pressures are something like 56 million when you take inflation, but more importantly, the actual pressures within the individual services like temporary accommodation, adult social care, children's, home to school transport. And so those service pressures minus the increased funding is what gets you to your budget gap. Now, it's worth reiterating, looking again at that table about, are we having our funding cut? Well, no, we're not having our funding cut, and neither are we actually, depending on what inflation is in future years, we're unlikely to even have our real terms funding cut, which is what was happening under the previous government under austerity. We should probably get a slide that looks at it back to 2010 if we're interested in that. But what the slide shows you is right. Our funding is going up by something like 16 million next year, and then 14 million the following year, and then 16 million the following year, and then over 16 million the next year. So our funding is going up, but the problem is the pressures that we're facing in this authority, which are not unique to this authority, but we have particularly a pronounced problem with homelessness and temporary accommodation. Now, clearly that has to be solved in a number of different ways. Building more affordable housing, and preferably social housing in my book, which is what the government are trying to do. Clearly the building of new houses can't happen overnight, but we've got to try and accelerate that. But also thinking more cleverly and smartly about temporary accommodation. I believe we need to bring more temporary accommodation in-house, and we need to purchase some more units of temporary accommodation as a way of providing better accommodation, but also bringing down the costs and not having to spot purchase from the private sector. Now, in terms of the loss funding, to repeat what I said earlier, the loss funding is versus what we had previously assumed in our medium-term position. So we're not getting cuts in real term, but we're getting less than we might have assumed based on last year's one-year settlement from the Labour government. So I think we just have to be really, really clear. The Labour government is not cutting real terms funding to local government, but we have a problem in that our service pressures are not being kept up with the ability to get income, and we're being very transparent that we think the government have made some mistakes in their current fair funding that will disbenefit us unfairly, and that is what we're lobbying on, particularly around how they calculate homelessness, as has been said. And then just quickly, the other question that was raised, there's a sentence about re-baselining on the ability to raise tax. I just want to be clear, and John can correct me, when we say raise tax there, we mean bring in revenue. So what the government is looking at is, how strong is your tax base? So in other words, how much tax are you bringing in because of the strength of your housing market or your business rates? What that isn't saying is your ability to put up the rate of tax, because all authorities have the same ability to put up the rate of tax, because that has been capped in the last couple of years and is likely to be capped going forward. So it's about, the sort of strength of your underlying tax base.
Thank you.
Before you go ahead, because I've got quite a few questions I'll add in at the end, but I just wanted to get some clarification, Councillor Taylor, on what you just said about the government isn't cutting the funding in real terms. Well, we've got this figure in front of us that says that with the fair funding formula, the impact of that will be that we'll have £7 to £24 million less over the medium term. So, yes, every year, of course, money increases, but the value of the spend of that money is impacted by inflation. And what this report is saying that actually the formula will cause us to have 7 to 24 million more, and that's helping to drive the scale of the savings that will need to be found over the next few years. So can you just clarify whether or not whether they are cutting in real terms?
Well, so when I say real terms, I would always compare to headline inflation. Now, you could say, well, is real terms comparing to your own cost base? Now, clearly, you're absolutely right, Councillor West, that versus our cost base, we have a deficit in the future years. And you're also right to say that versus our assumption in last year's MTFS, based on the 1 year settlement we got last year, we are forecast to get less from the government versus that. But I just wanted to make to be just clear in language, in that our overall funding is both going up in cash terms and it's going up in real terms versus inflation, but just not as much as we had assumed this year. And I agree with you, that's why we're lobbying the government, and clearly not enough versus the extreme pressure we're seeing in some areas like homelessness and temporary accommodation. So in homelessness and temporary accommodation, I don't have the figures to hand, but the level of pressure we're seeing there, 12 million into next year. I mean, John, you might have the figures to hand. I don't know what the overall budget is for temporary accommodation, but that won't be 4% pressure. Inflation is something like 4% at the moment. It won't be 4% pressure, that'll be 20% pressure, etc. So real terms funding is going up, but in the areas that we're talking about, not as much as the pressure currently is.
Okay, thank you. John, if you'll be asked to add some more on that.
Yeah, thank you. So just to confirm, I mean, as Jacob has said, the key point is, in terms of a lot of these figures here, are setting out the latest position after looking at the fair funding reforms compared to what we assumed when we set the budget at the beginning of the year. So, which is slightly different from, is it actually increasing in real terms or in cash terms? I think in terms of, there were just a couple of questions in terms of the 14 million, the 11% reduction in relative needs, how the homelessness thing feeds into that. So the 14% and the relative needs formula, they're sort of one of the same things. So what we're seeing is a reduction in our relative needs formula compared to what we previously assumed, which equates to that reduction of 14.5 million that's set out in the document compared to what we had previously assumed. The homelessness one is a little bit complex, because the government actually consulted earlier on in the year about changes to the homelessness prevention grant funding, which has now been rolled into the new settlement. So I'm pretty sure, and we don't completely know all of this until the government actually publishes its figures later in the year, but that is now all part of this sort of new funding formula. So there was one final point, which I think was around temporary accommodation. I mean, the pressure of 12 million compared to the budget for temporary accommodation. I mean, the budget for temporary accommodation, I think I'm right in saying, is somewhere in the region of sort of 25 to 30 million. So it is a huge amount in percentage terms. Of course, what's happening with temporary accommodation is, if you roll back 5 or 10 years, councils typically didn't have a temporary accommodation pressure, because the amount of money that you as a council would pay in rent in placing a family in temporary accommodation would be covered by housing benefit. But as rents have gone up significantly and benefits have not gone up significantly, that differential is increasing hugely. So as I say, if you roll back a number of years, councils didn't have pressures in temporary accommodation. Areas such as Brighton and Hove, where housing costs are relatively high, that pressure is increasing. So year on year, what you're seeing is a sort of a disproportionately big percentage increase in temporary accommodation as rents go up, which is obviously not being covered by the ability to pay that through housing benefit.
Councillor Midlands.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for explaining that, because it does say this will redistribute resources towards those authorities that have a reduced ability to raise council tax on one of those things, which, Angela Rayner did talk about. I won't go further on that, but I would ask, because again, you weren't around, but a few years ago, Brighton and Hove came together, and there were quite a number of costs involved in that process across that system. And yet there's nothing in here allocated for that which we suspect will happen. We don't know where it's going to happen. We don't know who we're going to subsume into our new authority or whatever. But, you know, it will happen, and there's nothing in here to pay for it. So that's going to be another increase on top of the 42 million spending cut or whatever it is you call it. So that's going to be an additional cost. And I just think it's poor planning not to have anything calculated against those perceived costs, because there will be costs. I was around at the time, you know, some people in Hove still haven't forgiveness for it, but, you know, it was a costly process, and reorganisation of any type is going to cost, and it's not in the report. So that concerns me. Thank you.
Yeah, go on, John, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, yeah, so just in respect of local government reorganisation, obviously it's unclear at this stage exactly what that reorganisation would look like. That ultimately that's a decision for national government. You know, this isn't a sort of agenda item particularly around that, but you know, you I'm sure will have seen the various different proposals that are out there across Sussex. But ultimately, it's a government decision in terms of what's implemented there. There will be costs associated with transition to new arrangements, depending on what those new arrangements will be. That might be fairly small for fairly small changes. It might be bigger if there are bigger changes. And obviously, Brighton and Hove isn't currently a two-tier authority, two-tier area. In two-tier areas, that change is probably much bigger than it might be in Brighton and Hove. I mean, one of the things that we've, I think, been very clear with government about is that actually, if there are significant costs of transition across the whole of the county, there needs to be appropriate funding to enable councils to successfully manage that process. So, but at this stage, obviously, we don't know the nature of what those proposals will be until the government starts to consult. But I don't know if Councillor Taylor wants to add to that.
No, I think that's right. But I mean, Councillor Meadows is correct that as we get closer to knowing what will actually be the case, what the government chooses to consult upon, we will need to put into our MTFS estimated costs of reorganisation, and there will be a cost. As John says, what we have proposed and was discussed yesterday at over in the scrutiny committee is obviously a relatively moderate change, in that clearly it's not moderate if you're in the areas that are proposed, but it relatively small geographic change to merge with some areas to the east. And as John says, we're not moving from a two-tier system to a new unitary system, and so the cost will be a lot less than creating a brand new unitary and merging multiple districts and boroughs. But there will be a cost, and when we get an idea of which proposal will be consulted upon, we should and will reflect it in our MTFS.
To just say on that, I mean, I was interested. It doesn't actually mention local government reform, and I appreciate we don't yet know what the settlement is, but there's no provision in here for a potential cost at all, is there? I didn't notice it.
Not specifically at this stage, no.
Chair, we know it's going to happen, but there's no provision, so I am concerned about that.
Okay. Councillor Gilman.
Just moving away from kind of cost a little bit.
There's a bit of feedback. I'm not sure what that is. Is that you, Jacob?
I don't think so. They're probably in the room. So I had a question just in terms of, I was just reading through the cabinet paper in section 12, and it talked about consultation and the consultation looked very much in terms of very broad groups. But I was just wondering if there's any kind of specific kind of consultation with regards to kind of those specific kind of groups like temporary accommodation, adult social care, that's been consulted on.
Yes, I think there's two things to say there. Last year we did something new for the authority, that we had an online tool, a simulator for budget setting. and we put that out and in the public domain for early budget consultation, and we had an event in Hove Town Hall with various people who came in, and we set questions, and they used the simulator tool. We had some interaction with that, and some people took it up. I think it was quite a good way to try and distill down the complexities of local government finance and expenditure into a way people can understand and engage with. So I think, resources permitting, we should probably do that again this year and see if we can push it out more and more. And then there's a sort of specific engagement, as you say, Councillor Gilmont, with specific service areas, users and providers. And yeah, there is work going on with temporary accommodation providers, but also our other homeless services in the city. I mean, there's almost constant ongoing work with those groups to try and get the best outcomes in this area, which is obviously trying to reduce demand. In other words, prevent as many people becoming homeless as possible, and then do things like block booking and managing the market as effectively as possible so that the costs are less if and when it happens. That's definitely ongoing, but I agree that we should feed that into budget setting and get as much input from those groups as possible when we think about what can we do in terms of measures that we set in the budget for tackling these issues on an ongoing basis.
Okay, right. If nobody else has got any questions, I'm just going to just bring us back to the report, because I have to say, anyone who's just listening to this without actually reading the report might get something of the wrong impression from what I'm reading. I've seen a lot of reports in my years, and I have to say I find this very alarming. And the gravity of what the council is facing is significant. And just to cover some of the points that have been made, and I know they've been referred to already, but this is the actual wording. The context of budget setting is very challenging, with increasing demand from statutory services, a reduction in resources as a result of government's fair funding review, a reduction in resources. So the fair funding review could cost us 7 to 24 million over the medium term. Now, the question I put on my notes there, is the government listening? Are they going to listen on that point? Because this is going to be a considerable problem for us if our assumptions here are borne out. The generating of asset disposals, 40 to 50 million over the medium term, the report says, and we've not talked about capital assets here. And I would love to know what of the family silver is in refrain to being flogged to meet that expectation. There's been a lot of talk about the reserves being the lowest in the country, and I'm glad to hear it's gone up a little bit. But nevertheless, the point that's been stressed is that the reserves, the report says, are perhaps the greatest risk to the council. The low level of reserves is perhaps the greatest risk to the council, and the recommendation given by John is that they're increased to 15 million, including 10 with 5 million risk reserve on top of the 10 regular general fund reserves. So we're not there yet. And this is against the backdrop of a forecast overspend of 15.5 million. I don't know if that's been revised. And how confident will it be that you can bring that down? A budget gap of £39.8 million for the coming year, and £95 million over the 3 years of the remainder of this Parliament. These are big numbers. And this is year on year. This is not good news. And I do appreciate Councillor Taylor likes to put things in the best light possible, but this is not, we will be hearing later again about the internal audits, what they're finding with the way that services are being managed, how they're coping with the expectations upon them. And increasingly, they are showing to be that they are failing in significant ways. and this is a downward trend. So I wonder how much more capacity services have to be able to create these transitions that we're facing. So I would have liked to have heard a bit more today, really, about how all this is going to be doable. And you've said, Councillor Taylor, that the funding is going up, and that we talked about whether that's in real terms. But government is clearly, in all of this, however you look at it, given the scale of the savings that need to be found, is not giving us anything like an adequate settlement. That's the reality of the situation, because that will be what will be forcing the council to make these savings. And I see that one of the provisions in the report is a rather grim sounding savings delivery board is to be set up. That's going to be a joy, isn't it? So I'm concerned really at the tone of the administration's response to this officer report. Given the gravity of the scale of the problems here, I would hope that you would be expressing greater levels of concern and worry about the deliverability of all of this, the achievability of all of this, and sending an even stronger message to government that we can't possibly do this and they've actually got to give us a proper settlement. Because that's what's actually been promised by this government, that it is going to, isn't going to be extending austerity. And frankly, if what we're looking at isn't austerity, I really don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way for you to end your long speech, Chair, because I think that's fairly instructive. That your last comment, which I'll come to, which is yes, you really don't know what it is, but we'll come back to that. First of all, apologies if there wasn't sufficient panic in my voice when I'm presenting it. To be clear, the report, which is not an officer report, it's a report in my name as cabinet member, and of which I authorised and completely support, does set out the seriousness of the situation. Absolutely, the authority faces a serious situation in both its in-year budget and its budget setting for next year. Now, I'm sorry I didn't come on the call and sort of break down or find it really traumatic. I can assure you that it keeps me up at night and I think about it every single day, and we work with officers every single week to both manage our in-year position and set our budget in the best possible way for future years. But I'm here today to present the sort of facts of what's in the report and the approach that we're taking to get there. To be clear, it is a very serious situation, both on an in-year basis and the gaps that we face in future years, but we're not panicking about it. We're getting on with the process of tackling it. Now, in terms of the last point you made about austerity and gaps, I think it's a really important point, and it's an important intellectual distinction that we have to make. We'll get the numbers up for all previous years, and that will help councillors when we get through the next stage of scrutiny and indeed budget council, and it will help councillors, including yourself, Councillor West, speak about things accurately. Here's an example from 2014 that I've just pulled up as an example. 2014-15 to 2015-16, the net general fund from 14-15 went from 225 million down to 220 million. Okay, so that was an actual cash decrease in funding and a significant real terms decrease in funding. What we're seeing now under the settlements that we had last year and the settlements in future are large-ish cash increases in funding and real terms increases versus inflation in terms of funding. Now, the point is, as we've said, is that certain service areas are under extreme pressure for various reasons. So what I'm trying to tease out is not say that we don't want more money. We absolutely do want more money and we're lobbying for it. However, I don't think it's a credible approach to say that the underlying pressures must simply be met by more funding to just meet those pressures. That's actually not an intelligent or progressive or socialist way to deal with these areas of public service. We have to tackle the underlying causes of those pressures. The underlying causes of those pressures are the broken housing market, the lack of affordability of housing, particularly in this city, and the homelessness crisis. The causes are the way that care is provided for in the country and the costs that are faced by care providers, and in some areas too much profit taking. So what we shouldn't do is simply provide unlimited funding to chase the broken system. You've got to fix the underlying system, and that is both what the Labour government are trying to do, particularly in the area of housing, and what the council are trying to do with our own council housing stock and with our own temporary accommodation. So to answer your last question, we've got to be very, very clear. This is not austerity. This is not real term cuts to local government finance. This is underlying pressures because of a broken structure of our economy that drive cost pressures, and the funding, which is going up in real terms, is not meeting that. So that's obviously what we've got to do as an administration. We take it extremely seriously and are working on it every day and every week to work on those pressures and work on the measures that we can take to make sure we're providing the same level of public service or better, but by trying to suppress the level of cost and demand that's faced by the authority. And that's exactly what we're doing. Again, I'm not glossing over what the report says, which you're absolutely right to say. The fair funding review at the moment implies a loss of funding versus our assumptions based on last year's funding, but it does not represent a reduced overall cash or real term settlement for the authority.
Oh, thank you, Councillor Taylor. I wasn't at all expecting you to turn up and to break down in panic, but I'm glad that you've said that you're taking it seriously, because I wasn't hearing that sort of tone in what you said initially. Obviously, the government does need to address the underlying issues, but meanwhile, this council has still got to actually pay for the services to respond to the individual needs of people presenting themselves to us. And that is what we're facing here over a period of time. It's going to be driving quite a hole in our budget. So that's the point that we've been making. But thank you. It's an interesting discussion. Have any of the members got questions that they'd like to ask Councillor Taylor? Okay. Right. Oh, Councillor Meadows.
Probably shouldn't ask this, but it is a cost and finance issue that if and when we annex another part of authority that is in the lowest tier system, they do not have responsibility for social care, they do not have responsibility for homelessness, they do not have responsibility for education. Those are going to be additional costs to us that they have never prepared for, they have no budget for. And so I just wonder, is it worth us as a council preparing for what might be coming through? Because quite frankly, we would be taking over district councils that never run those services before, never had a budget for those services. And I think preparation is quite key in these situations. Thank you.
No, I mean, I totally agree with Councillor Meadows, and to the extent we can meaningfully reflect it in MTFS, we should do that as early as possible. But I mean, just to reassure, yes, clearly there is a proposal. I would question the word annex. We're not annexing anybody. There is a local government reorganisation process happening nationally, and those districts and boroughs will become part of a unitary somewhere in the current historic county, so that they will become part of a unitary. The question is which unitary they become part of, but we won't be annexing anywhere. But just to reassure on cost, yes, clearly those districts and boroughs don't currently provide upper tier services like adult social care, and they don't have a budget for them, but the service is still being provided and there still is a budget for it. It's at the tier 1 level, so East Sussex County Council provide it, and they get the budget for it, and they make that provision. And so that budget will come across to, if this goes ahead, whatever new unitary takes place. So just to be clear, the social care needs of any area that might become part of a unitary authority, Peacehaven, Telscombe, will be provided for in the funding, because we will get the tier 1 council tax funding that would previously have gone to East Sussex County Council.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Meadows.
No, I mean, I totally agree with Councillor Meadows, and to the extent we can meaningfully reflect it in MTFS, we should do that as early as possible. But I mean, just to reassure, yes, clearly there is a proposal. I would question the word annex. We're not annexing anybody. There is a
I think John wanted to say something as well.
No, that's fine. I think Jacob has covered it exactly that. Obviously, part of any reorganisation would be to look at both tiers of councils and the cost associated with the service delivery in both tiers and the funding that goes with that. And that obviously that funding and cost base will go to whichever unitary emerges in the future, obviously depending on what the government consultation is and what the response to it is.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Councillor Taylor, for your responses. I'm going to move to the recommendations, which are, let me find it, that we note the report and the index. And I'm happy to do so. Thank you. Okay, I think after that robust discussion, we'll need a breather for 5 minutes. We can resume. That clock's never quite right, is it? But let's say brain work. 36 minutes past 5. How's that sound? That one there. Not that one. They're all different. Thank you, everyone. Our next report is the Internal Audit and Counter Fraud Quarter 1 Progress Report for 25-26. And Carolyn Sheehan will introduce with
Chair.
With Russell there as well.
So the report that you have in front of you is the standard quarterly progress report that we produce for this committee. So it gives you a summary of all the internal audit and counter fraud work that's been undertaken between April to June 2025. You'll see on there that there's 11 assurance reports and 1 non-opinion review, which were completed during this time. And you'll also notice that some of those audits were in progress in Q4 last year, and there's sort of a carryover of some of the audits that were in the plan from last year. So you'll see a summary of all of those reports included in the committee papers. You'll also see that 2 grant certifications were completed in the same period. And in section 2, you'll see there's a summary of the counter fraud work that's been undertaken. You will notice that in our performance that you'll see that the key performance indicator for the implementation of high priority actions has slipped a bit, and it's fallen to 76.5%. This related to 8 outstanding high priority actions. I'm pleased to say that we've confirmed with all the responsible officers and that 7 of those actions have now been implemented, so they are complete. And there is another action that's outstanding to do with off-payroll payments, of which we've also undertaken a follow-up report. So we will be reporting on that in the next quarterly progress report. You'll also see in the report in section 4 that it details any changes to the annual audit plan during the quarter. 4 audits have been agreed to be added to the plan. To accommodate this, we have used contingency days, some of our emerging risks contingency, and we've also removed 2 other audits from the audit plan with the agreement of management as well. Thank you. So I'm ready for sort of any questions that you may have relating to the reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Councillor Meadows.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Caroline, for the report. Reading through this, looking on page 23, I was concerned that there was an increased risk of non-compliance with procedures and regulations. It talks about delays and additional costs have not been factored in when purchasing home purchase scheme properties. So to me, non-compliance with procedures and regulations is a huge thing. Some of that is statutory and has to be done. So I wondered what kind of non-compliance that could possibly be. And then it says costs given to explain if social or usual rent is charged. Now, if someone purchases property in the council, they usually say, well, according to how much it's cost, we'll decide whether it's social rent or the usual rent, because obviously that money has to be paid back to the account. That's understood. But that could be a vast difference in the payback for buying a property, in my opinion. And the second to last bullet point of that part talks about insured stamp duty payments to HMRC are paid. I just wondered who was advising at the time, possibly not Angela Rayner, but who was advising at the time on that. And then as you go further down, it talks about the Brighton Centre. Again, policy and procedures not always followed. And then again in temporary accommodation on page 25, talks about current processes not always followed. So there appears to be a pattern or a theme here occurring. And I just wondered, what are we making from that theme? Is it just that staff training is not going ahead, or we've got new staff who are not always aware of what the current regulations are? Had those sort of thoughts. I mean, I can appreciate that home purchase scheme and temporary accommodation staff could be under pressure to just deliver the service that they've got. But I always remember that this is taxpayer and tenants' money. It's not our money. It's someone else's money that we're working on. So just make that point. And then my second bit going on is page 31. I was looking at 3.2, and I looked at the 7 out of 8 higher priority actions. One, I wasn't sure what an off payroll payment might be, so I had that question. But I also had a question about, is this an IT system? Because for many, many years, we have been trying to coordinate our IT system into one, which has been extremely difficult, I understand. And I just wondered if that was, says a system solution will be explored on this off payroll payments, and that will be follow-up reported in Q2. So I just wondered if that was part of that system. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That's quite a list. I'm sure Carolyn will go through it. Imagine John might want to answer on some of this stuff as well, the pay grid system and things like that.
What I'll do is I'll start and
Capture it
then,
all, do you think?
yeah, I'll
Make
start
the
and then I know that there's officers in the room who may also have comments as well. So in terms of the what you were mentioning first of all was about non-compliance of policies and procedures. I mean, obviously in our audit work, that is something that we're auditing against. So we're checking that people are following those policies and procedures. There's a range of reasons why people might not be following those. Some of those might be to do with the pressures of staff that you have alluded to yourself in terms of capacity issues. Some of it may be down to basic training. Sometimes the procedures themselves aren't particularly clear. And so staff are unclear of what their responsibilities are in that way. And sometimes it's about communication. To do with the home purchase scheme, there are some statutory guidelines in terms of the timelines of us doing those home purchase schemes. So sometimes we weren't always meeting those deadlines. And obviously what you've also noticed is HMRC, so we weren't always making those payments on time. So that's something that we do need to obviously improve. You asked for what is an off-payroll payment. So these are the payments that come under something called IR35. So they very much relate to very often consultants or specialist workers that you might have in who might work for themselves. They might be self-employed or they might work through a third party. And it's the duty of the council to determine their employment status and to check whether they should be on our payroll or we can pay them as a supplier, if you like. So there needs to be a very tight process there, because obviously if we get that wrong, HMRC might come knocking at our door and asking for some payments. So I think that's all of your questions, but please let me know if there's... Oh, about the IT systems. Yes. So as you may know, that we have a programme in place to replace the corporate systems. So that's the peer system, as you know it, the HR system, and also Civica as well, the financial system. There are some thoughts that within that programme that there may be things that can be done to improve those processes. So that is something that is being explored, I think, as that programme progresses. Thank you.
Yeah, well done. John, you didn't want to add anything?
No, that was covered. It's okay.
Councillor Haley-Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. Looking at page 27 and 28, looking at the St Andrew School and Tarnaland Nursery, seeing that there's sort of similar areas that they've come up as requiring improvement. So I've just got a couple of questions there. Is things both about the on-site contractors with level of liability insurance and employment status checks. I was just wondering, does council have a list of sort of contractors that already have those approvals in place, as that would ensure that schools and nurseries don't have to spend time and resources on completing these checks for insurances and employment status checks? And thinking about Tarnaland Nursery in particular, how did that review sort of come about, and is it usual for these kind of operational management issues in nurseries? And are nurseries supported differently to schools in terms of the level of support they get from the council to deal with any issues like this? Thank you.
Just checking who should take that. So did you want to? Yeah, okay. So in terms of how those audits came about, so we only do sort of a very small number of schools per year. It's part of the school audit programme. So we do consult with children's services, and we also consult with the school's finance team to sort of get an idea of what schools might benefit from our review, because we can't get around them very regularly. St Andrew's School actually asked for that review, so just to note that. So they were quite proactive in that they felt that they needed a review. So these problems that we're finding, they're not unusual, and I think there is obviously quite a lot of pressure on schools. So but I think in terms of some of the other questions you asked, it's probably better to hand over to Deb. Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, Councillor, for your question. I'll attempt to answer them, but I won't have all the details here. I think the first thing to say from the outset is the council doesn't run schools or nurseries in the city, and I think it's really important clarification for a committee to be aware of. As Carolyn has said, we do have an arrangement where we will go in and audit schools, often at the school's request, as in the case with St Andrew's School. It's a sense check. It's an opportunity for them to see, have an idea of what's going well for them and areas where they need to make improvements around that. In terms of the council's role in that, what we aren't responsible for is implementing the audit actions. What we are responsible for, though, is encouraging and supporting the governing board and the school's leadership team to follow through on the actions that our audit team has identified for them. So there is a support and challenge role that we provide in that respect. In terms of do we provide a list of contractors? To be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. We are there to provide a sense of advice. I can clarify whether or not we provide a list. I doubt that we do in that respect, because again, we don't run schools. So in terms of taking on that responsibility, we don't have the resources to do that.
Thank you. Well, it's a very good sign that schools which have obviously a more distant relationship than council's internal departments are, requesting help from audit. It's really, really good to see. Okay. Is that your question covered, Councillor? Anyone else? Okay. Oh yes, here, late hands. I didn't see which one went first, so I'm going to go to Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report, and I do have some questions. First one is around, Caroline, sorry. First one is around attendance management, which is shown on page 23. I see that we're exceeding our 10.9 FTE days, target days. You may not have this information with you, but I'm sure you can answer in broader sense. How does this compare to our peer authorities? Sure. Do you mind if I ask you one question and you respond, or do you want me to give I prefer to go question by question. So would you like to answer that? Then I have another couple.
Right, okay. So for the attendance management, one of the things we looked at as part of that audit was we just had sort of a brief look at, and I stress it was a brief look at what the national average was, and obviously looking at neighbouring authorities. And the conversation we had with management was that it would be good to review that target and to do a more comprehensive benchmarking exercise to see where we think that Brighton and Hove should be, or where that target should lie. And our understanding is that that kind of exercise hadn't been done for quite a while, so that was something that needed to be done.
Just to confirm, thank you for that. We are doing that benchmarking now. So what we've been doing is putting in place data monitoring, making sure we have that view of council services and attendance levels across that, and then doing that work to benchmark against comparator authorities as well. And that will inform future policy design and any other systems and support we can put in place in future.
Okay, Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Next one then is around the Brighton Centre. So there were some issues reported around purchasing cars, raising purchase orders, very typical Joy type things, timesheets, etc. So what it makes me think is clearly sort of training is needed in this facility to embed controls that are applied across the rest of the organisation. As we know, in these financial tight times, every penny counts. Once training has been undertaken, is there a case for any kind of non-conformance to policy to be included in performance management? And this kind of leads me to ask, what are we, how are our other more sort of arm's length organisations managing with this? I'm a question mark still. I've written Visit Brighton, but I'm not sure Visit Brighton is the same kind of management. But anyway, other organisations that aren't quite as close, that are slightly on the periphery. Thank you.
So I'll just describe how that audit came together, really, and then I might hand over to Alan, so that I think he's got some more to add. That cultural compliance review is obviously looking at corporate policies. It's very much looking at policies in all those areas. Part of the reason why the Brighton Centre was chosen was because it can feel a bit removed from the rest of the council because of where staff work. So it's just sort of making sure and that those policies and procedures are being embedded, and that people are following them, and that they're communicated to people. And this is the only way that we kind of find that there are issues, and whether there are wider issues as well. These are audits that we will be doing in other areas as well. So they will be popping up in some of the audit reports. We won't be doing loads of them, but we will be doing a few over the year. And so you might be able to sort of compare what's happening across the organisation. But I'll hand over to Alan.
Yeah, excellent question. We really, really welcome these audits because it gives us that ability to have a whole council view. The Brighton Centre is an integral part of our operations, and where services are working in the frontline areas, we do need to have consistent standards, whether they're working at the Hove Town Hall or the Brighton Centre or the Housing Centre, wherever they work, with consistent standards. One of the things we're looking at is looking at those common trends and themes that are coming through from these audits. And that's helping us, as my directorate, working on a expectations for managers toolkit, something that we can look at for particularly around management induction. So for people that progress with the organisation into management and senior management roles, or are new into the organisation, what are those expectations and key things around being a manager? For example, looking at contract management as well, for example, how we manage attendance management. These are all common themes, things that we really welcome being put to us via our audit colleagues as well, so we can help have a more strategic response to it.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you.
I will come to you, Councillor Baghoff. We'll let you keep running with this one for a moment.
Thank you, Chair. So next is temporary accommodation, block booked and spot purchase payments. So there was mentioned that finance staff were left to identify areas and anomalies which clearly wouldn't be correct. Clearly, the staff who are actually actually booking the accommodation, the ones who should check what the number of nights were, etc. So I've noticed also the mitigations sound good, as only the service would be aware. Okay, right. But the number of nights, etc. I thought we had a dynamic purchasing system for this, and if we do, clearly it's not working. And in my cabinet advisor role, I'd be interested to hear what improvements are to be made to the contract management.
In terms of the dynamic purchasing system, Councillor Robinson, that is coming into play this year. It's not currently in place, and that is part of the response to this audit, which, as Alan says, we do welcome in terms of homes and adult social care, particularly as we did commission this piece of work, because we recognised there was definitely some areas that we needed to improve on, and having some external insight into where those areas would be was helpful. But in parallel, we were looking at the dynamic purchasing system, which will help us with some of these actions.
You happy, Joy? One more, okay.
Thank you. So on page 32, we talk about fleet procurement. So it's just a comment really. So I'm pleased to see this item is on the list for audit review, as requested by officers. This issue came up in my cabinet advisor role as procurement and contract management. So I'm pleased that, and also the service at the same time felt that an audit was required. Do we know when that will take place? Thank you.
Yes, so that has actually been completed. It's just a draft report is out there, and they're just looking to finalise the report. So if that's finalised for the end of Q2, then I'll be able to do it for the next. I'll be able to report on it for the next committee, but it will depend on finalising that report.
Councillor Baghoff.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I just had some, first of all, I need some clarifications for some terms. Something like, what is the difference between direct and indirect equalities implications? Can you give an example of an indirect and direct implication? Equalities, indirect equalities implications. That is the beginning. What is
Can you turn your mic off, Councillor?
Yeah, let me look at it. Sorry, my laptop's just, stopped working. So, say.
You've got another question you want to ask before we get an answer to that one, is that? Otherwise you need to turn your mic off.
It's the updating the internal editing at the beginning.
I'd quite like to deal with this one while we're waiting. Really.
Okay. Let me go to the next question. I'll come back to that. Okay? I'll go back to that. My next question is page 22, and it's concerning the public health locally commissioned services. It's good that we can see that it has reasonable satisfaction with and the management and everything going well, but we have a weakness around, was it mentioned, to verify claims data, which needs straightening identification of anomalies. Can you explain to us how this is done?
Are you okay to answer? Councillor Baghoff, turn your mic off.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, could you clarify what page you were referring to with that?
I think it was 22, you said.
The results is fine. Oh, yes, I've lost it again. The results is fine, but apparently we have identified that opportunities for further to strengthen the control environment that is around and verify claims, to verify claims data and strengthen identification of anomalies. So what process exactly? Can you explain what process you're doing to rectify that?
Yeah, 22, 1.29.
1.29. And maybe one question one, or shall I ask the other one as well? Yeah, that one first. Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you. So you're talking about the public health, locally commissioned services, and you're talking about there were some improvements that we discussed with management. So that verifying the claims data is just making sure that claims data, the information around that is really clear. And that they identify where there are any variances or any things that are flagging up, and making sure that they act upon that. So it's just about, so as we were saying, the overall opinion of the audit was reasonable assurance, but this is an area that they could further improve. So we're saying if you really want to further improve this process, these are the sort of things that you might undertake.
So the identification is within the council and not with the people we are commissioning with.
No, so this is about the claims that they come from the suppliers in terms of the public health, but they obviously relate to individuals, so making sure that information is robust.
Yeah, but my question is, what's the process? How do you make it robust if it's from the other end? What have you put in place? What is the process of, making sure it is robust when it's concerning the other party?
So that's about the council having in place an agreement with the supplier about what sort of information that they might need to verify those claims. So making sure that they ask for that information, and also that the supplier provides that.
Well, I'm not sure I understand, because I believe that from the beginning there would be already an arrangement that a certain information is required from you, okay? But I think here what they found was the need for verifying the claims. So there are information which expected, but it seems that the information needs verification. So that's the process I was asking. How would you ensure, and what process do you have for verifying? I'm not sure that you have answered. Maybe I've not understood. I don't know if other people have understood.
To Boston.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor. In terms of having that information, you're asking a very specific question around a very specific process, which my audit colleagues just won't have that level of information. That level of information will be held within our public health team. So, Chair, with your permission, I'm happy to take away an action and ask the Director of Public Health to look at what that process is and provide a short briefing to a committee on that, so that you can have that information. We don't have that information to hand today, so we're not able to answer that in this meeting. Thank you.
I think that's very helpful. We have to remember that the auditing officers are just looking at how the service operates, but that service is responsible for the minutiae of the way that they conduct themselves, the policies that they have and deploy. So audit officers won't always have the answers, but it's very helpful having senior members of the management side to be able to answer some questions sometimes as well. But thank you for your question. You have another one?
Yes. The other one is apparently to adopt the embed key elements of the council's corporate contract management framework. So I don't understand why it wasn't embedded in the first place, because it's part of the contracts in the council. Sorry, and what part exactly of the framework wasn't embedded?
So that's quite a common finding across all when we're looking at contract management, and it's something that we have been flagging to management that contract management framework needs to be communicated and embedded across the council. And I know that there is significant work that's taken place to try and move all of that forward. So this was just another area when we looked at it that they weren't completely complying with that framework. So that's something obviously we will comment on in our audit report. But I don't know if anyone's got anything further to add about the contract management programme.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't have something to comment on where we are right now. Where we're going, though, is that we are, again, thanks to these audits and picking out these common trends and themes, we're trying to create a community of professional practice and expertise when it comes to contract management. So something that our organisational development and learning team are looking at is understanding all the contract managers around the council, facilitating them to come together, what are those key standards, and again, embedding that into other toolkits and forms such as our management expectations. That's an ongoing piece of work, something that we're very alert to thanks to areas such as this, and something we want to get some improvement on going forward.
Are we good with that? You have another one?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This one actually fine. It's about the attendance. I noticed that the attendance gradually increases in the, the absence, the attendance, of course, it increases during the years. So I just wondered whether you have sort of worked out and focused what would be the possible reason for the attendance to be, gradually increasing the percentage of attendance, or whether. Yeah.
Hi there, thanks. Another good question. When it comes to attendance, what we're seeing is actually a national picture. This is something which the UK as a whole is experiencing across the workforce. It's going to be different for different roles across the organisation as to those specifics. And it's one of the reasons why we put in place new monthly dashboards so that senior managers actually have live views of their team. They can drill down to understand what the issues are. We're standing up a corporate programme to look at this. What are those areas of sickness, absence, what's causing those? It is different for different parts of the organisation. Staff that work in frontline roles that are directly supporting people, for example, we might experience increases in illness and sickness, and they may not be able to work from home in the same way that an office worker could be able to do that to stop the spread of disease and illnesses. So we're looking at what are those issues, what are the common themes, and standing up, looking at areas of other councils that have done targeted areas of wellbeing support to see if we can actually reduce down the amount of absence periods that we have from sickness over time. There's a big impact, obviously, in the council's efficiencies, productivity and performance, but most important of all as well, we want to support our staff to be well in the workplace. So there's something around working well, looking at the vaccination programs that we've offered in previous years as well, when it comes to winter illnesses, and doing what we can do in the preventative space, similar to the work that our other people and demand-led services do to help members of the public, also looking at that focus inside as well. We've recently refreshed our corporate health and safety work. That would be going to cabinet this week, and part of that is a new focus on well-being. And we've also refreshed our governance, which has that look at staff well-being in the workplace as well. And a subgroup of that will bring together our public health colleagues, trade unions, to also look again at what can we do in the workplace, what are we doing differently, how do we understand the issues that are causing spikes in sickness here. And again, just referring back to the benchmarking that we want to do, if there's good practice happening by other councils, I believe Manchester and Camden have also done some good work in this, what can we replicate and duplicate here at a certain pace to help the council, our staff well-being and the council's overall productivity and performance.
And if I might just add on that, I think you touched on a very, very important topic, talking about vaccination. As the Health Secretary has said, I think today we won't be taking any lessons from Donald Trump about medical matters. I mean, it's a very serious issue if people are being confused about how they can trust medical advice and the medicines they should be taking and vaccinations. So hopefully our people are more sensible than that. Councillor Backoff, you have another question?
No, not a question. I just want to thank you for your answer, and you answered a question which I was going to ask about whether there's enough support for the, for the workers, which is in place. Very good. And I think it's a very good initiative that you brought it in-house so that you can really, scrutinize the details and work towards improving it. And of course, learning from other councils. I think that's a very good initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've covered all the questions. Great. I've just got one or two actually I might just ask as well. There's six partial reports in this first quarter, 2 of which are schools. And I look back at the 24-25 report that we took at the last committee meeting. I couldn't see a number for the total number of partial assurances, but there was a graph. And I think it was something like 16 in total for the year, something what I could gauge from looking at the graph anyway. And that then led to an annual audit opinion of partial assurance across the piece. So what I just wanted to know first of all is, are the schools included in that final figure that was reported at the last committee? So if it was something like 16, then in total, then 6 this time suggests that all things being equal over the next quarters, we're heading for a record number, which is quite concerning. Is that in any way accurate?
So I'll defer to Carolyn to answer whether or not schools were included in that number you were quoting. But I think one of the things I always say with regard to audit opinions is we need to be careful around treating it as a numerical calculation in terms of how many opinions there are within a year and what impact that has on the annual audit opinion. The opinion is based on risk. So yes, the numbers are relevant, of course, but they're not the primary driver for the annual audit opinion. So I think it's right that the committee be concerned about the numbers of partials over the course of the year. But it's where those partials are that really do drive the annual audit opinion. So, for example, partial assurance opinions in key financial systems, for example, would be a major factor driving the annual opinion, whereas partials in schools would be not quite so significant. I think it's also important to bear in mind that in a number of cases, and we've had some examples today, where management direct us towards particular areas where they feel there may be a need for strengthening the control environment. And so that often will lead to lower assurance opinions, but then there's always an immediate response to addressing the actions. And I think having an organisation that is receptive to internal audit and uses internal audit as a tool to identify and secure improvement is a sign of strong governance. So I think in answer to your question, we absolutely will and need to keep an eye on the numbers, but it's that they are not the primary driver. And one of the things I think we did last year and we will do this year is, as the year goes on, if we see those partials appearing in areas of real significance and the numbers being higher, we will give the committee an indication during the course of the year as to what impact that's likely to have on the annual audit opinion. But clearly this is quarter one and it's too early for us to say that at the moment.
Yes, obviously it's a good culture that services are coming to you, that they're self-identified that they've got a potential issue and they're seeking your assistance. But that is always the case over a number of years anyway. So that's a bit of a given in all of this. So okay, I'm not going to lie. I was looking for clarity. It is the first quarter. We can only assume take so much away from it, but I did find the headline figure of 6 quite concerning. But more, and I've a further question on this really is looking at the substance of the reasons why they got a partial. So there are. It seems to me, and I think others have alluded to this, there's some threads in here really about so what I'm looking at records not being kept properly, monitoring not being necessarily effective enough, costs not being controlled, points like that. And is it a management capacity issue to be able to ensure that not only are policies in place, but they're actually being delivered against, and that there is perhaps not sufficient management capacity quite often where you discover an issue? Is that a truism or not?
I think it's fair to say that last year, and it's probably a continuation of that now, resource and capacity were factors that were affecting issues of compliance and operating against procedure.
John?
Just to quickly add to that, I suppose there were 2 things I wanted to say. Firstly, I suppose just to echo the point that Russell has made. There's been we've got significant financial challenges across the council, and there are financial challenges across much of local government sector at the moment. And I think it would be it would be wrong of me not to be open and honest about the fact that actually resource constraints sometimes do impact on the ability to put everything in place that we need to have in place to in terms of the audit framework. Having said that, and those pressures continue into the current year. Having said that, I think it would be wrong of us as a sort of management team to say, and therefore we don't think we can deal with the issues raised through internal audits last year and improve them. One of the things that we need to be really focused on, I think, between now and the end of this year is making sure we're implementing recommendations that are coming out of internal audit reports, and particularly focused on let's say some of the sort of key areas of key financial systems, some of those things which I think, as I understand, certainly from internal audit, are the key drivers of their audit opinion. So it may be that we can't come back to the next committee and absolutely everything is completely fine. I'm sure there are things that will work their way through, but we've got to focus, I think, on the key financial systems and implementing kind of some of the audit recommendations to get into a better place. But yeah, I mean, resource constraints and financial challenges are a live issue for us at the moment. We know that.
Well, I think that's something we want to keep an eye on, because our services funded adequately, appreciating that we are in a financially challenged position, and that this is perhaps what we're seeing as it's reflecting that, and that we need to be assured that services will be able to carry on to be able to not have potentially some serious failure. That what we're looking at is hopefully not a trend towards that, but it may well be. Okay, thank you. I haven't got any further questions. Have anyone else got a late one here? No? Okay. In that case, I'll move to the recommendations, which is where are we now? I'm on the wrong one. What page are we on? Page 13. They're all jumbled up. That we note the report. Do we agree? Okay, thank you very much. And I thank all the officers for presenting. And before I forget, because I'm going to say this to our team here, what we need to do, because we have so many different officers turning up to this committee, that I think what we need is you to identify yourselves a bit more. We need the name cards, because I don't know who everyone is. We've had quite a lot of new faces. I'm not close to the management side of the operation. It makes it a little bit embarrassing for me as well. So it's not your fault. We need to make sure that we're addressing that in committee, I think, but for all members to be sure who they're asking questions of. Okay. Great. So we'll move on to item 23, which is the Global Internal Audit Standards Self-Assessment and Quality Assurance and Improvement Plan. So Russell.
Thank you, Chair. So just to very briefly introduce this report, the reason it's coming to this committee is that one of the key responsibilities of the committee is to satisfy itself that the council has in place an effective internal audit service. And one of the key ways that the committee can assure itself of that is through our compliance with professional standards. Those standards, which were previously public sector internal audit standards, have been replaced from April this year with a new set of global internal audit standards, which apply to all internal audit services, regardless of sector and regardless of, obviously, of country. Fortunately for us, two things. Firstly, the global standards are not hugely different from the previous public sector internal audit. And secondly, we knew and we had been independently assessed as being fully compliant with the previous set of public sector internal audit standards. So in conducting a self-assessment against the new global standards, we found that we were already highly conforming and that the areas where we needed to take action were relatively minor in nature. So what I've done with this report is provided you with an appendix which lists the sections within the global standards, just to give you a sense of just how far-reaching they are and how in-depth they are. But I've not provided you with all 144 pages of this self-assessment itself. But it is available on request if any member wishes to see it. I would say that at a previous audit committee in another authority last week, one of the members did actually ask for a copy of the full 144 pages. It is available if you wish to see it. More importantly, Appendix 2 is our Quality Assurance and Improvement Programme. Now, just to explain, that's a term that is used within the standards. And this particular plan is not just about the areas where we needed to take some action to ensure complete compliance with the standards. It's areas of general improvement and ongoing service development. So you'll see within that action plan, some areas, some of the actions say compliance with GIAS, whilst others just say improvement activity, and that's just to distinguish between the two. As you'll see, there are only two areas where we felt we were not either fully compliant or in the process of complying. I can confirm that one of those, number 11, is now green, fully complying, or is fully implemented rather. And of the remaining amber ones, most of those are activities that are need to happen during the course of the year and can't be fully implemented until next year. The one red action is one that is something that I need to discuss with all of the Orbis partner authorities, given my role spans a number of different organisations. And it's just about finding a pragmatic way of officers, senior management engaging with the chairs of audit committee to ensure there is feedback into my performance evaluation as the chief internal auditor. So Hopefully, the committee will find this report reassuring. We're confident that we will be 100% compliant by the end of the year. And just to confirm as well that and in a similar way to the previous standards, we will be commissioning somebody independent to come and carry out full independent external assessment of us against these standards at some point, probably in the next 2 or 3 years. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Russell. I mean, coming to that point about, I think it's activity 25 on page 47 you're referring to, which is the red one, which obviously my ears picked up when I read it, because it talks about the chair of audit and standards and their involvement with your performance assessment. And given what the lady from SIPFA said about us having to own this process as a committee, I would imagine it would be appropriate if your performance is seen as being part of this, then I perhaps should be representing the committee in that process. So you've got to find a way of that being comfortable. I won't make you feel uncomfortable if I'm there, though.
Just coming on that point, absolutely. I think the challenge for us is that I think these standards were written for an organisation that has its own singular internal audit service and employs its own chief internal auditor. So for our arrangement, it's slightly more complex because actually my performance evaluation is carried out by the Chief Operating Officer of East Sussex County Council. That said, clearly John and John's opposite numbers at Surrey and other organisations also have a view. So that's why I say we've just got to find a pragmatic way of capturing all of that and ensuring that that is all fed in.
Okay, understood.
I mean, only to say, we'll work with Russell in internal audit to kind of develop that, but yourself and the committee are an important part of that process. So we'll kind of find a way of making sure that gets fed in.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions on this one? Councillor Loughlin.
Thank you, Chair. Russell, just to go back to reference 11 on page 45 regarding the issue about ensuring staff have in place underpinning personal objectives, which you were alluding to. Is there a sort of planned timescale for that? Is it a blanket timescale that applies across all departments, or is it staged, phased in?
Thank you. Well, 2 things. Firstly, that's now green. That's fully implemented and embedded. And just to explain, the reason it was red was not because it didn't happen. It was because we just needed to update it. So, and that update has now taken place. And every member of the team has their own set of personal objectives against which their performance is monitored on a monthly basis, actually, as part of our programme.
That sounds like quite a pressure if it's a monthly review.
So every member of staff has a monthly one-to-one supervision process. And as part of that supervision, there's a discussion around the objectives. So it's not necessarily a formal scoring, but the monthly supervision includes consideration of personal objectives as we go through the year.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands, so thank you for that, and thank you for doing so well with the scoring. Always impressive.
Sorry, Chair, I did forget to add one further point. One of the areas of compliance, conformance with the standards is to update our internal audit charter, and that is attached to this report, a refreshed as a charter as Appendix 3, which we're asking the committee to approve as part of the recommendations. And just to explain, that charter is in all intents and purposes the same as the previous one. It's just been updated to change some terminology to align it with the new standards.
Just getting the recommendations in front of me. Yeah, we're on page 39. We're asked to note the self-assessment against the new GIAS and the resulting QAIP, which now I can't remember what that means, but I do. And the committee approves the update to the internal audit charter, which is what you're saying, Russell. We need to actually approve that. So, do members agree with the recommendations?
Agreed.
Okay. Right. So, patiently as ever, Victoria, we're on to the whistleblowing interim update, which I think you'll be delivering. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm delivering this report on behalf of the Director of Governance and Law, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So you'll be aware that this is an interim update on whistleblowing. You'll recall that a whistleblowing report was brought in April to this committee. On that occasion, it was reporting on the outcome of a review of the whistleblowing arrangements at this authority. It proposed a policy which was adopted, and I think it was a healthy general discussion about the policy, about how it all worked. But during that conversation, this committee expressed interest in having an interim update on how the policy was being applied and on the number of complaints received in sort of mid-year. So that is that report. This report gives you an indication of the data on complaints received in since this new policy was introduced in April. So that's just 5.5 months data. You'll note that there's a table in the middle of the report which goes to those 10 complaints that were received in, which gives you a flavour of the source of the complaint, the sort of the general theme, and it gives an indication as well as to whether or not those complaints were referred to a different process, whether or not they've been fully investigated, if they've been investigated, what the conclusion, what the outcome was, or if they remain in train. And you'll note that a few of them remain in train, but for the most part, the majority, I believe, have been dealt with. But as I say, it's not. I'm sure this committee isn't intending to go into the detail of any of those specific whistleblowing concerns, which obviously are considered by the Director of Governance and Law and are dealt with appropriately, being directed in whatever way is most appropriate. So as I say, interim report, more full report coming to you with a full year's worth of data in April, but I'd be very happy to take any questions on the report that's before you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. And I think before we just go to questions, I've just mentioned that at the chair's briefing, I requested that table 1, as it's labelled in the report, which is actually the second of the two tables, that shows on page 139. I asked for that to include the date of referral and the expected time scale for determination, because that wasn't in the original drafted version. And officers agreed to put the month of the referral because they didn't want to get too close to giving the game away on a particular complaint. So that seems reasonable because it allows us to be able to then compare that referral date in the first column with the expected outcome. It often says in the last column, anticipated conclusion, so and so, and it can help us keep track of whether these complaints are being processed quick enough in our opinion. So that was helpful. Thank you for doing that. Councillor Gilmore.
So just a couple of questions. The first one is just in terms of the whistleblowing policy itself and how it's delivered to officers, how they understand it. So we've got inductions, blogs, understands on pay slips. So I was just wondering, is there anything else that you're thinking of putting it on? You know, is it going on the wall anywhere, or are you thinking that's where we need to be at the moment? So that's the first question.
Thank you, through you, Chair. On the wall isn't something you tend to do so much anymore, just because we don't all come in all the time, and it's hard to know who you're capturing when you do. I think that that's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? Just kind of bring it to people's attention because it's only meaningful if people know it exists and use it. So I think it's an ongoing project. I will certainly touch base with Liz about other ways of bringing it to staff attention that haven't already been tried, possibly by flagging it up at whatever level meeting we possibly can, and including it in whatever kind of standing agenda items, just as a mention with the link. But yeah, very helpful to remind us of the need to keep on that.
And just a second question, so just digging into the data and the outcomes from that, so from not upheld to recommendations in terms of management improvement. So when you have a kind of a management improvement in a certain area, is there anything that kind of goes up the chain and then kind of goes out to the other areas? So if there's a certain issue within one department, you can kind of go up and then the learning can then kind of go across and down. I was just wondering how you kind of have that mechanism.
Through you, Chair. I'm afraid I'm going to have to lean on Liz for a more detailed account of how that's worked, including possibly specific examples without obviously, getting into the detail that would be sensitive. But yeah, that's my understanding of how it works. I mean, the challenge of whistleblowing concerns is obviously they could be small, they could be large, they could involve findings being reached that would be useful across the organisation or in a specific service area. They could signal a particular issue in a particular area of the council, or they could result in learnings that are usefully disseminated across the organisation. So my understanding is, because Liz has oversight of the whole thing, she's quite well placed to decide on a proportionate response that gets the change to where it's needed. But perhaps you could hold that thought, and we could. I can provide information to you between committees, but I think maybe it's important to have the conversation in public session, and maybe that's something that Liz could talk a little bit about when she comes back in April next year.
Councillor Helliwell.
Thank you.
Next.
Oh, okay. A bit too previous.
I think Lucy has something on the next agenda item, but I just kind of wanted to jump back in on the data though. I was just wondering, Victoria, did you have any kind of learnings from that very simple kind of data that we've got so far on the years? Because I mean, there isn't a huge shift, I suppose, in terms of complaints. So it's always that kind of difficult thing. If you've got I suppose there are a few more in the 2025 column, but is that showing that our system is working, or that there's just more kind of practice that's being, brought up, really? It's a difficult one to say. It could be one or the other, but I was just wondering what your viewpoint was on it.
Well, the first thing I'd say, and I'm not being humble, but I don't have the oversight that Liz does of all of the complaints and the detail. So if I know about them, I'm only going to know about a few of them. So I'm not going to have that educated perspective. But what I would say is clear from the data. First of all, I mean, the perceived wisdom is that it's good to have some whistleblowing concerns drawn to people's attention, because evidences a degree of trust and confidence in the system that, if you report something, it can get flushed out, and hopefully you'll be protected if you're a worker. But also it signals that everyone knows about the whistleblowing arrangements and are using them, which is better than there being issues that aren't being noticed. Well, maybe they're being noticed, maybe they're being lived with, but there isn't that confidence to actually do anything about them and to flush the thing out. So the wisdom, and I've seen it said in many different fora now, is that it's good to have a healthy number of whistleblowing concerns drawn to the organisation's attention. And in terms of the data and the number of complaints, I think the report says there aren't any themes that have been identified in this 5.5 months data. The other point, I think, in terms of the actual number of them, is that it's not too far off last year, in that there were 20 for the 12 months up to April 2025, and there appear to have been 10 now in this 5.5 months. So Doesn't look as though there are great numbers more than there were this time last year, but as I say, the more meaningful conversation hopefully can happen in April of next year. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. So I think you've raised some really good questions, and it's actually really helpful with that we're having an interim report here, because I think we don't want to lose sight of what you've asked, Councillor, and I think we need Liz to respond to that. And when we get that final annual report from her, then hopefully there'll be some reflection on the points that you've raised. So as long as we're capturing that today, you might want to follow up yourself, because you know exactly the point you're trying to make here. I'm sure Liz will be receptive to those, and we can be in a good place by the end of the year, hopefully. Okay, thank you. Councillor Meadows.
Thank you. Yeah, just following on really about data, but also about people, because it says that there has been a conclusion, and it's anticipated conclusion, investigation concluded, recommendations made. I just wondered how people felt at the end. Do you find out how they feel about the conclusions that have been made, or the recommendations that have been made to the service, for example, or the conclusion of the investigation, as they may feel quite still aggrieved in some way, that they've put themselves out there on the line, done the whistleblower policy, and then the outcome is not what they expected at all.
Yes, through you, Chair. I mean, yes, people aren't always going to be happy with the outcome, and that's going to be the reality. It is very helpful if they can feel that they're raising the concern was a worthwhile exercise, and that has been a thorough interrogation of whatever it is that prompted them to raise the concern, and that it's been looked at fairly and transparently, and that appropriate action's been taken. And my understanding is we do go the extra mile in feeding back as much as we can, obviously within constraints of sensitivity and so on what action is being taken. So if there's a simple action around, I don't know, the existence of a particular policy, bullying, harassment, or whatever it is, and it's felt useful to circulate that and remind managers, then that would be notified back to the complainant. In terms of whether we actually collect data in any kind of serious, substantive way, I don't know about that. That might again be a conversation for next April. My understanding is, and this is entirely, it's entirely as it should be, that the whistleblowing process does pick up on concerns of all types across all areas from all sorts of individuals and stakeholders. So it might be that it's a bit difficult to generalise as well.
I can see the risks here as what you're saying, really, people being disappointed and putting people off. But I think one of the difficulties when you make a complaint is it's something has happened, and you're not necessarily giving much attention to how realistic is it for me to expect that complaint to be successful, because the burning matter for you is the matter of the complaint, isn't it? So it's really difficult. But I think what we need to be sure of is that people aren't left feeling abandoned, really, that there's appropriate follow through, so that they understand the reasoning for the outcome, and that they're not feeling dismissed, that they're feeling valued for having made the effort, even if it proves to not be something that can be upheld. Victoria.
Yes, through you, Chair. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Like what does success look like? Because the whistleblowing, I mean, if you have an individual grievance, if something's gone wrong to you personally, and you're a member of staff, and we do have policies where that can be pursued to try and settle, that you could lodge a grievance or whatever. The whistleblowing process is primarily, as I say, it's available to all, but it is primarily about the health of the organisation. What's the culture like? Is it healthy? Can we change it? Are the things that are wrong that need to be winkled out? And that might not give the individual exactly what they want, but it doesn't mean it's not an important exercise, and it doesn't take away from your starting point, which was, or anyone bringing a concern needs to feel confident and needs to have a sense that the thing has been looked into, which is what it's all about, isn't it?
Councillor Middens.
Yeah, just coming back on there, I mean, it would be interesting. I mean, this is early days, isn't it, with the whistleblowing policy? It would be interesting to see if it's ever counted against anyone, if they go for to get a higher paid job or a pay rise or whatever within the council. It'd be interesting to find out whether it's counted against.
Be able to answer that. I mean, it's all to do with different cases, isn't it?
Yes. Again, for you, Chair, it's absolutely not supposed to work that way. That is not. But there's a regime, there's statutory protections for a worker who makes a disclosure that's protected, and that is something we're very scrupulous about. So, yeah, I think I can provide reassurance that we do signposts. There are external agencies that are available to support people who feel that they're, not being treated fairly as a result of making a protected disclosure. And I can provide reassurance that a lot of time and energy does go into making things work fairly.
And so we're going to have a lot more to discuss on this in April. So don't lose the thread of those points, and we can come back again. I don't see any fresh hands, so I'm inclined to move to the recommendations, which of course I've never got in front of me. Where are we? Not far away. But we note the report, including the whistleblowing referrals and outcomes. Committee agree? Right, that brings us on to our final report, which is the standards update, which is Victoria again.
Thank you, Chair. Well, you're very familiar with this report. You receive it every time that this committee meets, as indeed is the proper thing to do, because this committee is charged with the responsibility for assisting the council in carrying out its statutory responsibilities to promote and maintain high standards of conduct by elected and co-opted members. So that's why you received the report, as you know. The report gives you information on the complaints that you've already heard about, and the complaints that have cropped up have been made since the last report to this committee. It gives you a certain amount of data about those in the appendix, and it also seeks to provide reassurance about other aspects, both that we are keeping a watching brief on any changes, legislation, as I keep saying, the serial meetings of this committee. We are on the lookout for the government's response to the consultation recommending changes to the standards regime and the changes in sanctions and so on. I have not heard of anything. I have looked. So those will be brought to you. That government response will be brought to you as or when it happens. And it's also a little bit on member training. Obviously, we've had 2 new members elected in by-elections this year, and they've both been invited to training. There's also going to be refresher training offered to members who are already familiar with the Code of Conduct and seek to have a refresher. So that's this report. Very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So that was my question, was that can be offered as a refresher for others, not just the 2 new members? It is. Okay. Yeah?
Yep.
Councillor Meadows.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we've had this report through many times, but it's the first time I noticed on page 2 where it says the members concerned having agreed to apologise for their oversight. Now that triggered something in me, because yes, I did make a complaint about someone once, and I was told they'd apologised, but they hadn't apologised to me, they'd apologised to officers. So looking at the conclusion, it says that they had excluded a campaign group. How do we know that they have actually apologised to that campaign group? I mean, do you ever follow up on these things? Do you ever check that recommendation has been undertaken?
Yeah. Just to clarify, this isn't about you, is it? You exampled something similar that happened in the past. Okay.
Exactly, Chair. That was my experience, that someone was told to apologise. They did apologise, but not to me, the complainant. They apologised to officers, but this one says they're going to apologise. I just wonder, how do we make sure that that apology actually exists to whoever made the complaint?
Victoria, you happy to answer that? I mean, we're
Yes,
getting
no, I'm happy to
close
answer that. No, we do normally keep a tight grip on these things because there's no point in just kind of leaving people to get on with it. It's usually necessary for the informal resolution to arrive at a place where you have the confidence that if someone needs to be apologised to, they have actually been apologised to. So although we would often be the post box, so we would communicate the apology as the third party, we would normally have seen it. If we're talking about it, we'd normally have seen it. Obviously, we don't want to, treat people like children, but we do tend to oversee that part of the process to make sure it's happened. Because there's no point in just reporting on something if it's not happened. I don't have any personal recollection. I probably was involved, but I can't recall the particular one. If you mentioned apologies being made to officers, we don't normally have people apologise to us, certainly not members, and almost nobody actually that I can think of. So normally, if there'd been an apology, it would have been, I wish to apologise to Councillor Meadows or whoever. Okay, well, if there's a specific one you'd like me to look up, I will absolutely do that. We can have a conversation separately about it. But yeah, we do take care over it. It's terribly time consuming, but we do it for the most part.
Good, I'm pleased to hear that because, I know absolutely nothing about this, but, if someone has made a complaint, do they actually get the apology? And I will follow up with you on that one because you do remember it.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Haywell.
Thank you, Chair. I don't seem to be me setting off the mic at the moment. Yeah, just looking at some of these complaints, there seem to be a lot of online issues these days. And so I'm looking at, there's a few of them, but I'm seeing one that's been resolved, T2025, page 148, where there has been a apology, but I'm just thinking that these online comments are in a very public forum, are forever for people to view. And should we be thinking about apologies being equally public so that if people see the original post that was offensive or deemed to be needing an apology or whatever, that apology is linked to it?
Thank you. That's an interesting point and a good one, I think. If someone's made a public comment, then why would the apology or the remedial action not happen in the same forum? And I can recall under a different standards regime, that would be the sort of outcome that would be achieved on occasion, and it would be about applying a proportionate response. Obviously, this is a much softer economy of member complaint process, and the reality is that it's difficult to compel members to take specific actions. I can't recall which specific one this was with certainty. I believe I know which one it is. There will be instances where we absolutely will seek an apology on the same forum to catch the same people who've seen the original comment. Just as there'll be situations where we'll work quite hard to get the comment taken down. It probably won't have been on a forum that we control, so it's whether or not that can be negotiated, and that's about all I can say about that. Obviously, we have the standards regime we have, and we're able to do what we're able to do, which isn't always possibly as proportionate as we want, and that's the current situation.
Councillor Loughran.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question, Victoria, that I'm pleased to hear that there's refresher training coming up. I think that's needed by members. And my concern is about members wasting officer time or wasting council time, in the sense that when you look at the complaints table, there's a lot of recording of insufficient evidence available. And I just wondered whether officers have any record of the time spent on investigating complaints relating to these standards, and how we can quantify that financially, because I think all members would like to know what is the cost to the council of this behaviour. Thank you.
I think we're getting a lot less complaints than we used to. It's already. Somebody else on?
Yeah, I'll just leave it if that's okay. Yes, we have time recorded in the past. We don't time record at the moment. We try and just do it on top of the rest of the day jobs, just to sort of fit it in, this sort of activity. It is, it's not necessarily, it can be a fiddly and fussy, but not terribly meaningful feeling. It can be hard to know how to quantify it. It's quite a bit of going back and forth and quite a lot of process. We don't time record at the moment. If there's a mandate from members to change that, and that's something we can think about doing. Obviously, the more stuff about the thing you generate, the more stuff you then have about the thing, and then the more is obviously publishable and releasable information requests. But that's one approach, certainly, to flush things out in that way. As I say, the feeling is that we just try and get through it, and we try and do it as briskly as we possibly can, and we just try and get on with the rest of the possibly more important elements of the work that have a more direct bearing on residents, possibly. But that's something we can look at in the future if you wish it.
Councillor Gilmore, none of us obviously want to go home tonight.
Sorry, be quick. I'll be quick. I think it would be quite interesting just to have a rough idea. And no one wants to kind of go down to kind of time management stuff. It's horrible, isn't it? But it would be quite interesting to know roughly how much time does a complaint take. Obviously, they vary in nature, of course. And I wonder as well, and we've already talked about this, whether it might be worth. Because I suppose if you're making a complaint, sometimes you're in heat at the moment. You're there in front of your laptop, typing it up, sending it off, and whether the other groups would be up for having a bit of a sense check in that, in terms of if something's been sent through, it kind of it goes through the whip or a member within the party. I know the Greens don't have a whipping system, so it might be someone else. But then there's a bit of a sense check before it then kind of goes in as a complaint, because if you get something in there and you go, well, there's no real kind of concrete information here, that it's not going to go anywhere, then that's a massive waste of everyone's time. So I don't know, I'm just kind of putting that out there, I suppose, to Pete and Anne, to maybe kind of feedback to their kind of groups and stuff.
I think we do that. I think we have conversations with our members that aren't as focused on it as members in the committee are, and the whips need to be, really. Because they should be advising their members on, how best to deal with their concern. And, it may not be to make a complaint. Maybe it's a matter of being realistic about expectations. That sort of thing. The potential lack of evidence. I try to help my members with that, but they'll want to make their complaint, because sometimes there's, even if they don't necessarily think it will be successful, they want to put a marker down, because in their minds something did actually happen, and that's true. It's there's a difference between what happens and whether or not you've got a case that's strong enough to take a full weight. And I think we see that from all sides. It's not just from our group. I'm just saying my reflections from my point of view. But we all need to be doing this in each group, to make sure everyone's being realistic but supported.
But I'd just come back on that in the sense that if you're putting a marker down, you're not really adhering to what the process is. Either you kind of meet the threshold and there's a complaint there that's upheld, or you're not. If you're well below the threshold, then the idea of just putting a marker down is kind of carte blanche to lots of complaints kind of going in, I suppose. That would be my viewpoint on it.
Well, we're not the experts either as to what is actually going to make the grade anyway. That comes down to the officer's judgment. So my advice is not particularly expert in that. I've got a question that kind of does fit with this, really, because it's about why 2025 The monitoring officer interpreted this as a robust exchange in context of local politics. So, you know, that really is a judgment call, isn't it, by somebody? And what I'm mindful of is that there is no appeal to that judgment. And if you go to the Ombudsman, that's only, did they follow the process correctly? Yes, they did. But it's the question here is about the judgment. And how do we deal with that one, really? How do we, because if the accusation is that one politician is not being accurate in what they're saying, and of course it's done in a public forum where everyone's taking lumps out of each other politically, yes, it's in a political context, but the underlying case that's being made is that person wasn't necessarily being, well, they were being economic with the truth, potentially, something like that. So how do we as a committee feel assured that the judgment, the professional judgment of Liz, of yourself in this is correct?
Yeah, well, for you, Chair, it's a very good question. So, and it's an important challenge as well because it reaches to the heart of the thing. The first point I'd say is that Liz doesn't delegate, doesn't authorise us to make the decisions for her. She's monitoring officer, so she makes all of the final decisions. So at least you have that consistency of the one person who's very experienced. Obviously, she hasn't been monitoring officer for years and years, but she's very experienced in this area. In terms of kind of the way in which the decisions are made, I mean, there are some ways of looking at things which we have brought over from the old standards regime. For instance, this business about robustness in local politics. It's you know, the old Standards Board for England used to generate big chunky case reviews, and it was always the case. And I think most people would think it's fair that robust exchanges between members are expected to have a slightly tougher skin than members of the public who don't have a forum, who aren't able to publicise their views in quite the same way. There is that grey area where it comes to maybe an exchange which is, where tempers are running high. I think the situation you've mentioned in terms of like factual accuracy, that's tricky, isn't it? It's about how people represent the situation and whether or not there's been a misrepresentation, and that's a difficult thing to have confidence in. I do take the point. All I can say is that we try and be transparent, we try and be fair across the groups. Obviously, we have the system we have, and I think initiating some kind of appeal process would take up a chunk of resource we don't have, would create difficulty because we only have the one monitoring officer. We do have a large number of complaints as well. I don't think that's something anyone is suggesting at this point. As I say, all I can do is reassure you that Liz does apply a consistent approach that brings to bear all of her experience in this area, and which tries to take a proportionate approach to complaints where, in a context where there are no sanctions in any event. So some of the work can involve signposting to other process, but it's all about working with the process that we have and the system that we have.
I'm going to leave it there, but I'm sure these sorts of conversations to be continued. Right, everyone's packing their bags. We've got two more items, But we need to move to the recommendations first, unless anyone else has got any more questions on this, which I think, and I haven't got them in front of me, but I'm sure it's just to note the report. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay, members agree? Thank you. Right, so the last two items to be referred to council, and remember, they're just for noting and not for debating, so yes, might not be worth the paper, but anyone got any suggestions? No, okay. And the final one is items for next meeting. Now, we never exercise this opportunity, so we can put things on the agenda.
Needs the next meeting so we can know what part
We've got the special meeting. I don't know if that fully counts, though. because that's to look at the VFM. I wasn't assuming it doesn't count as a normal meeting, but that's special council.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll just be the one item. So it'll be January. That's why we're having the meeting in November, because it will be too late by January to talk about all that in context of the budget. So January we're looking at.
Well, it's pre-February. It'd be good to have a good scrutiny of the budget.
In February we could have a good scrutiny of the budget.
No, in February we agree the budget. So in January, if we're having a meeting in January, it would be a good time to scrutinise the budget.
Yeah, so, okay, so today we've talked about November, we'll have something relevant. And so again in January, we'd like to look at the budget then. Yeah, okay. That's fair enough. I mean, it's just that we won't be in a position to shape it very much because it'll be almost done by then, won't it? So that's why we wanted to do it early. Do members agree with that? I mean, I suspect that Councillor Taylor will be chomping at the bit of the opportunity to explain it all to us through this forum. I don't think there's anything to be concerned about. I think it should be part of the consultative and running out of words in that process of having a look at this thing, asking a few questions. You're happy?
So, I mean, just briefly, and I think Councillor Taylor referred to it earlier on. The budget is expected, depending on sort of announcements from central government. Although we hope we'll have enough information by then. The draft budget should be going to Cabinet in December. So before the publication of that report, obviously all we can provide is a sort of broad update in the same way that we have tonight. But after that December report has gone out, obviously there's an opportunity to scrutinise the budget in detail because that will be out for formal consultation and such like anyway. So if that works in timing, I'm sure we can bring something back in January. Councillor Taylor's not here to confirm or otherwise, but the draft budget will be available for scrutiny at that point in time.
Well, we can't assume that Councillor Taylor will be available, but I'm sure if he is, then he'd be happy to do that.
The reason I'm asking for that is because Ackfield Council, when we debate it and we have the big budget stuff, you get 3 minutes. At scrutiny, we are allowed a little longer to ask your questions and get your point across.
Yeah, and obviously we can't award ourselves special privilege as members, but it's about what this committee should be doing, and I think it's important this committee's looking at the budget. Councillor Roberts.
My question would be, is this place the appropriate place to scrutinise the budget? Maybe, and I attended my first scrutiny committee yesterday, and I think it was really good that members of the opposition had a good opportunity to ask the questions they wanted to ask. And as you saw today with the openness of Councillor Taylor, the questions will be answered. So maybe it's not quite right for it to come here because there's only one member of your party and one member of the Greens here. I don't know what the procedure is. Thanks, John.
Well, okay, I'll let John speak, but we've had a report today on a preliminary part of the process of the budget. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally inappropriate about us looking at these matters, John.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's certainly not inappropriate to look at it. I don't know that it's for me to, comment on that element. What I was going to say is the sort of budget report from the summer has gone to both the People and Place Scrutiny committees over the last 2 weeks, and both of those committees have asked for an update when the draft budget is available. So there's probably just a question in terms of this committee not duplicating that specific work, albeit I do appreciate as a committee you do have you do have sort of responsibility and oversight for of the sort of financial controls and such like of the council. So it may be worth us just thinking about exactly what element of the budget would be relevant to come back here, taking into account that it will also go to People and Place Scrutiny probably at some point in December or January.
Yeah, we would need to look at this through the lens of our own responsibilities and the way that we won't be asking the same questions that scrutiny would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we can think about.
So do you think we can agree to do that? Yeah? Okay. All right, good. In that case, I'll close the meeting. Oh,
Sorry, Joe, I was just going to ask, do we know what the November special meeting is?
what the date is? You've had the date. You've had the date. It's November the something. We'll look it up for you.
It's a question just in terms of what will the
It's a special meeting. Do we know what the content of it is? Rather, no, I know the date.
25th of November.
I know the date. What's the content?
So I was going to say, so the reason, so my understanding of the reason for this committee meeting in November is to look at the external audit report, both in terms of their report that feeds back on the accounts audit, but then also the work around value for money. So that the sort of the timescales for auditing our accounts this year are such that it would be too soon to come to this committee, but then we didn't want to wait until the next calendar year before the external auditors fed back on their reporting. So the plan, as I understand it, I hope I got that right, is to do that in November.
I think you're quite right, John. I've got a bit confused as well because we've had the item in November is happening in November because our January committee is too late to get the decision required for that audit process. Their interest in the budget, which fell today, is a different matter, but it's become a bit confused, I think, in my mind anyway, why we were actually having that meeting in November. Councillor Gilman.
We had a discussion earlier in the summer in terms of the external audit, particularly so external audit in terms of how they deliver the information and it being a bit, inaccessible, to put it lightly. And I was wondering if it's possible for that November meeting, if we can look at the formatting, we can look at how that's written, and that's really pushed back to the externals. Because I know we had that meeting on it, and there were quite a lot of kind of actions that we listed, but just to make sure that when we get to that meeting, it's not in the same format, it's readable, it's digestible for all members. That'd be really, really useful.
Point taken. I'll feed that back.
Great. Okay, if we're all done, I'll close the meeting. Thank you. It's been a bit of a marathon.